What if there was once an empire so vast it stretched across half the world, and yet almost no one speaks of it today? Why do maps from just 2 centuries ago show a land called Tartaria, while our history books are silent? Was it simply a name for distant lands, or could it be evidence of a forbidden history deliberately erased from our memory? Tonight, we uncover the story of the lost empire of Tartaria, a world of buried cities, strange architecture, and whispers of forgotten technology. A mystery woven into the fabric of our past. Welcome to Whispered Empires. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like this video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, let us begin our journey into the shadows of history. For centuries, cartographers filled the blank spaces of the world with sprawling empires and mysterious lands. Among them was one name that stretched across Eurasia, Tartaria. To trace a finger across a 16th, 17th, or even 18th century map is to encounter it, an empire so vast it dwarfed even the mighty Russia or China. Tartaria, or Tartary, as it was often called, covered Siberia, Central Asia, and sometimes even the far reaches of North America. And yet today it is gone. No country bears the name, no textbooks tell its story, and no history classes recall its kings, armies, or cities. Instead, we are left with a question. Why did a land that once dominated maps vanish almost overnight from the pages of history? Old maps show us more than geography. They reveal what people of the time believed, feared, or sought to control. Tartaria appeared consistently in European and Asian cartography. In 1600, a European scholar would have spoken of Tartaria as a great unknown expanse, populated by nomadic tribes, strange peoples, and perhaps even great cities. The name itself became a catch-all, describing lands beyond the familiar empires. And yet the borders, the sheer size, the prominence of the word on these maps suggests something more than just terra incognita. Take, for example, the maps of the French cartographer Guillaume Delisle in the early 1700s. His atlases present Tartary as a sprawling entity that nearly enveloped northern Asia. Or the works of the Dutch mapmakers, whose detailed engravings showed Tartaria not as empty land, but as an organized region with names of provinces, rivers, and cities marked within its expanse. This wasn't just a blank wilderness. It was, at least to their eyes, a structured world. But here lies the mystery. If Tartaria was merely a broad term for steppe lands and unknown peoples, why was it drawn with such authority? Why did it appear not just on 1 or 2 maps, but across the board, from London to Amsterdam, from Paris to Moscow? And more importantly, why, by the late 19th century, did the name vanish, replaced by the familiar geography of Siberia, Russia, and Central Asia? To see Tartaria on a map is to confront a ghost, a reminder of something we are told never truly existed. But the maps remain. They hang in archives, hidden in libraries, whispering of an empire erased not by conquest, but by silence. Some say Tartaria was never real, a figment of confused geography. Others suggest it was real, too real, and deliberately erased by the great powers of the modern age. The maps don't answer these questions, but they start the story. And so our investigation begins not with myths, not with speculation, but with ink and parchment, where the name Tartaria once stretched across half the world. If the maps of the early modern world gave us the first glimpse of Tartaria's size, then the encyclopedias of the 18th century gave us something even more compelling: descriptions. These were not simply vague outlines on parchment. They were entries in reference books, supposedly the very foundations of knowledge, that spoke of Tartaria as if it were as real as France, Spain, or the Ottoman Empire. Open the pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica from its earliest editions in the late 1700s, and you will find an entry for Tartary. It is not a small footnote or a dismissive remark, but a description of a vast country divided into regions such as Chinese Tartary, independent Tartary, and Russian Tartary. Each is defined with borders, peoples, and climates. The tone is authoritative, leaving no room for doubt that Tartaria was a recognized entity in the intellectual landscape of the Enlightenment. Other works of the period follow suit. European encyclopedias and gazetteers list Tartaria among the great territories of the earth. To scholars of the 18th century, this wasn't some myth or half-heard rumor. It was knowledge codified, cataloged, and passed down to readers. Tartaria to them was not a mystery, it was fact. And yet, here is where the puzzle deepens. If Tartaria was such a common entry in encyclopedias, why do later editions by the 19th and early 20th centuries no longer contain it? Instead, the land once labeled Tartaria is broken apart into Russia, Siberia, Mongolia, Central Asia. The old name disappears almost completely, like it had never existed. What happened in those intervening years? Was it simply that exploration refined what had once been a vague term? Or was there, as some suggest, a deliberate erasure, a rewriting of history to conceal the existence of a forgotten empire? Even more curious is the language used in these encyclopedias. Tartaria is described not just as barren land, but as home to peoples of significance, with customs and practices worth noting. If Tartaria was only a placeholder for the unknown, why bother with such details? Why categorize it into provinces? Why give it the weight of legitimacy? The answer may lie in how empires write history. The Enlightenment era was a time of cataloging, of ordering the world into neat boxes of knowledge. When Britain, France, and Russia expanded their influence, they redefined the territories they controlled. Perhaps Tartaria was simply swept away under new labels, convenient for the rising nation-states of Europe and Asia. Or perhaps it was more than that. Perhaps the disappearance of Tartaria from encyclopedias reflects a larger story, not just of naming, but of forgetting. And so, the old encyclopedias serve as silent witnesses. They tell us that, not so long ago, Tartaria was considered a vast and real place. Yet today, those entries feel like echoes of something deliberately buried. When the encyclopedias changed, so too did our memory. But the question remains, was it a mistake corrected or a truth erased? If Tartaria appeared so prominently in maps and encyclopedias for centuries, the question naturally follows, where did it go? Unlike the rise and fall of Rome, the conquest of the Mongols, or the collapse of Byzantium, there is no dramatic record of Tartaria's decline. No great war, no final battle, no chronicles of conquest. Instead, the empire seems to have faded into nothingness, replaced not by memory, but by silence. By the mid-19th century, something peculiar happens in the world of recorded knowledge. The once expansive Tartaria shrinks. In some atlases, the name is relegated to obscure corners of Central Asia, a vague label for distant steppes. In others, it vanishes entirely, replaced by familiar modern divisions: Siberia, Mongolia, Turkestan. Encyclopedias that once described it as a mighty land now omit the name altogether. The empire, as far as official knowledge is concerned, simply ceases to exist. But how does an empire disappear without explanation? Nations rise and fall, but their echoes linger in history books, ruins, and oral traditions. Rome left us roads and monuments. The Mongols left chronicles and descendants. Even the fabled Atlantis, a civilization that may never have existed, endures as myth. Yet Tartaria, supposedly covering vast swaths of Eurasia, leaves behind almost nothing. Mainstream historians often argue that Tartaria was never an empire at all, but rather a geographic term used by Europeans to describe lands inhabited by various nomadic tribes. As explorers gained better knowledge of Central Asia, the vague label Tartaria was broken down into specific nations and regions. By this account, Tartaria did not vanish. It was refined out of existence, replaced by more accurate names. But to alternative researchers, this explanation is unsatisfying. They argue that the disappearance was too abrupt, too absolute. Why, if Tartaria was simply a geographic label, was it treated for so long as a distinct entity, complete with provinces, peoples, and even rulers in written accounts? And why, when new names replaced it, did the old name disappear so thoroughly, almost as if it had been deliberately erased? The strangeness deepens when we consider timing. The 19th century was an age of empire building. Britain, France, Russia, and others were not just expanding their borders, they were rewriting history to suit their narratives. To some, the vanishing of Tartaria is not coincidence, but part of a larger pattern, the erasure of rival pasts to justify the present order. A vast empire in Asia, with advanced architecture and culture, did not fit neatly into the story of European dominance. So where did Tartaria go? Perhaps nowhere. Perhaps it was always there, but renamed, fragmented, hidden beneath other histories. Or perhaps it truly was an empire, erased by design, not just from maps but from memory itself. And here lies the enigma. Unlike other forgotten civilizations, Tartaria's absence is not marked by ruins in the desert or legends in ancient texts. Its absence is marked by silence, an empire that seems to have been edited out of existence. The story of Tartaria begins to unravel the moment we compare what older sources say with what modern historians claim. For centuries, maps and encyclopedias presented Tartaria as a distinct entity, a vast region marked with borders, cities, and provinces. But ask a scholar today, and you'll often hear a very different explanation, that Tartaria was never an empire at all, merely a vague term used by Europeans to describe distant, poorly understood lands. On the surface, this explanation might seem reasonable. After all, early explorers often gave sweeping names to regions they knew little about. But the problem lies in the details. Encyclopedias of the 18th century don't speak of Tartaria in vague terms. They describe it with confidence, breaking it into subdivisions like Russian Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and independent Tartary, even going so far as to note its populations, climates, and resources. The language of those entries is not hesitant, it is authoritative, as though Tartaria was as real and solid as the kingdoms of Europe. And yet, within less than a century, the name disappears almost entirely. Later editions of the same encyclopedias erase it, replacing the word with Russia, Siberia, or Mongolia. It is as if the territory had never been unified under a single identity at all. This sudden disappearance raises troubling questions. Were earlier scholars simply mistaken, writing fantasy into their reference books? Or did something shift in the way history was recorded? The timing is worth noticing. As the 19th century unfolded, Russia expanded deep into Central Asia and Siberia, consolidating its empire over lands once marked as Tartaria. At the same time, Britain and France were imposing their own colonial narratives across the globe. In such a world, the memory of a vast independent empire might have been inconvenient. Erasing Tartaria from encyclopedias and maps would allow new powers to frame these regions as untamed wilderness rather than lands with their own legacy. The contradiction, then, is stark. The old records speak with certainty of Tartaria's existence, while modern history insists it was nothing more than a word. The maps and encyclopedias tell one story. The textbooks we are given now tell another. And between these two accounts lies the silence of Tartaria, a silence that feels less like an accident of geography and more like the deliberate closing of a door. Was Tartaria simply a mistaken label, an error corrected by later scholarship? Or was it something more, a forgotten empire whose memory was intentionally wiped from a collective record? That contradiction remains unresolved, a crack in the story of history itself. By now, we have walked through maps that mark Tartaria as a vast dominion, encyclopedias that cataloged it with the weight of fact, and the curious contradictions of modern history that insist it never truly existed. And here is where the story sharpens into mystery. Because while most lost civilizations leave behind ruins, chronicles, or myths, Tartaria leaves something stranger, the deliberate absence of evidence. This absence is itself the most haunting clue. For how can something appear so consistently across centuries of maps, so confidently in the reference works of the Enlightenment, and yet be dismissed today as nothing more than a misunderstanding? If Tartaria never existed, why was it drawn with borders, provinces, and capital cities? If it was only a vague label for nomads and steppes, why did its disappearance from knowledge happen so suddenly, so completely, and so silently? Imagine an empire spanning Siberia, Central Asia, and beyond, described as real for centuries, and then, within a few generations, erased so thoroughly that modern readers must dig into dusty archives just to find its name. That erasure is where the mystery lies. It is as though someone closed a book mid-sentence and locked away. Conspiracy researchers suggest that Tartaria is not simply a forgotten word, but the memory of an advanced civilization. A culture that may have left behind the grand architecture we still see scattered across the world. Cathedrals, star forts, intricate domes, and palaces that seem to surpass the abilities of their time. They propose that in the 19th century, a global catastrophe, perhaps a mud flood, perhaps a deliberate Great Reset, swept away its remnants, allowing the rising powers of Europe and Russia to seize the narrative and erase Tartaria from memory. Mainstream historians dismiss this as fantasy. They argue that Tartaria was nothing more than a catch-all term, abandoned when knowledge improved. But even they cannot fully explain why the name persisted so long with such authority, or why its disappearance is so total. The mystery of Tartaria is not just about whether an empire existed. It is about the rewriting of history itself. Who decides which names survive in our books and which are forgotten? Who has the power to shape memory on a global scale? And what else besides Tartaria might have been erased? As we close this first chapter, we stand at the threshold of a forgotten world. Maps and encyclopedias have opened the door, showing us the outlines of something vast and hidden. But to step through, we must follow the clues further, into buried architecture, strange photographs, and theories of catastrophe. Tartaria may be gone from our textbooks, but the silence it left behind is loud. And that silence calls us deeper into the shadows of history, where the forgotten empire waits to be rediscovered. To understand the mystery of Tartaria, we must first grasp the sheer scale of what it was said to encompass. On the old maps of the 16th through 18th centuries, Tartaria was not a small local kingdom, but a landmass so large it rivaled entire continents. Stretching across northern Asia, it began at the edges of Eastern Europe and extended deep into Siberia, spanning the steppes, the mountains, and even reaching toward the Pacific coast. To the west, its territories overlapped with the Russian frontier. To the east, they bordered China and Mongolia. And to the north, they touched the icy waters of the Arctic Ocean. Some maps even extended Tartaria across the Bering Strait into what would later be called Alaska. This vastness is what made Tartaria so striking to cartographers and readers of the time. Unlike France, Spain, or the Ottoman Empire, Tartaria was not defined by small boundaries or compact borders. It was painted as an empire of space, a dominion so broad that its very immensity seemed to defy comprehension. For Europeans who had never traveled there, Tartaria became a kind of other world, a mysterious mirror to their own civilizations, stretching across the roof of the earth. The geography of Tartaria, as recorded, was diverse and daunting. To the south, it included deserts like the Gobi, endless stretches of sand and dust where caravans braved the Silk Road. To the east, it bordered fertile lands near China, rich in trade and culture. The north was marked by frozen tundra and forests so thick that travelers described them as impenetrable walls of pine. The west was dominated by wide grasslands, where nomadic peoples roamed with herds of horses, echoing the movements of the Mongols centuries earlier. Encyclopedias of the time divided Tartaria into recognizable regions: Chinese Tartary, which included Manchuria and the lands near the Great Wall; Russian Tartary, stretching across Siberia under Moscow's influence; and independent Tartary, a cluster of Central Asian khanates and kingdoms. Some maps even marked Great Tartary, a name reserved for the entire northern sweep of Asia, dwarfing all surrounding empires. But this geography was more than lines on a page. It suggested unity. An empire with recognizable boundaries, subdivided yet connected, vast yet coherent. And this is where the contradiction sharpens. Modern historians tell us these lands were always fragmented, inhabited by nomads, tribes, and scattered kingdoms. Yet the maps, the encyclopedias, and the descriptions of travelers present Tartaria as if it were a singular dominion, a super empire with its own identity. Could it be that Tartaria was a construct of European imagination, a convenient label for lands they did not yet understand? Or could it be that there was indeed a civilization, perhaps not unified under a single ruler, but bound together in ways now forgotten, a network of cultures and territories erased from our history books? The geography of Tartaria, with its deserts, mountains, steppes, and frozen seas, remains the canvas on which the mystery is painted. Vast, diverse, and commanding, it was the stage upon which an empire, real or imagined, once stretched its shadow. If Tartaria truly stretched across such immense geography, then who were the people that lived there? And what kind of culture held together such a sprawling dominion? Here we encounter another layer of the mystery, for while mainstream historians describe Tartary as a loose collection of nomadic tribes, older sources depict a world far more complex, almost hinting at the identity of a lost civilization. Travelers of the early modern period, from Marco Polo to Jesuit missionaries, spoke of peoples in Central Asia who lived in highly organized societies. Some accounts describe sprawling cities with walls and gates. Others note thriving marketplaces where goods from China, Russia, and even the Middle East converged. While modern history relegates these to minor khanates or isolated trading posts, maps and encyclopedias often suggest something broader, a network of cultures under the umbrella of Tartaria. The people were often described as hardy, nomadic horsemen, reminiscent of the Mongols, but this stereotype hides the diversity recorded by earlier sources. In Chinese Tartary, there were mentions of agricultural communities, sophisticated irrigation systems, and cities that mirrored the grandeur of Beijing. In independent Tartary, European accounts describe rulers known as Khans, whose courts featured intricate ceremonies and traditions. Even in Russian Tartary, beyond the frozen tundra, explorers noted fortified settlements and communities adapted to harsh climates, thriving in ways outsiders struggled to understand. One of the most intriguing aspects of Tartarian culture is its supposed architecture. Conspiracy researchers point to the star forts, domed buildings, and monumental structures scattered across Eurasia and even into North America, arguing that these could be remnants of a shared Tartarian aesthetic. Mainstream archaeology attributes these to separate local builders: Russians, Ottomans, Persians, Europeans. But the repeating motifs across distant lands spark a question. Were they echoes of a unified culture, or simply coincidences explained away by modern historians? Religion and spirituality also add to the puzzle. Many records describe Tartars as following Islam, Buddhism, and shamanistic traditions, depending on the region. Yet older maps and missionary accounts often depict them as people of deep cosmological belief, tied to the stars, the cycles of the heavens, and great elemental forces. This ties curiously with conspiracy narratives that imagine Tartaria as a civilization with advanced knowledge, not just of engineering, but of the cosmos itself. What makes Tartarian culture so elusive is the lack of continuity. Unlike Rome or Egypt, whose art, ruins, and texts survive to tell their stories, Tartaria seems to have been absorbed and overwritten. Its people were renamed as Russians, Mongols, or Central Asian tribes. Its cities were reattributed to other empires. Its architecture, if indeed it was theirs, was claimed by local histories. In this way, Tartaria did not just vanish from maps. Its people were scattered, absorbed, and hidden in plain sight. So when we ask, who were the people of Tartaria, we stand before a paradox. The encyclopedias and maps describe them as real, varied, and significant. Yet the textbooks of today dismiss them as a footnote, or worse, as nothing at all. Did their culture truly disappear, or was it rewritten under other names? If an empire's true identity can be found anywhere, it is in its language and traditions. And in the case of Tartaria, these traces are among the most enigmatic. For while modern history insists that Tartaria was never a single culture, older sources speak of shared tongues, rituals, and customs that suggest something far more cohesive than scattered nomads. The word Tartar itself, later softened into Tatar, was often used broadly by Europeans to describe the peoples of Central Asia. Yet the languages attributed to Tartaria varied across regions. In some encyclopedias and missionary accounts, the people of independent Tartary were said to speak Turkic dialects linked to the Great Khanates. In Chinese Tartary, the languages leaned toward Manchu and Mongolic roots. In Siberia, explorers noted indigenous tongues, some of which are still spoken today in fragments among Siberian tribes. To mainstream historians, this diversity is proof that Tartaria was never unified. But to alternative researchers, the common threads between these dialects hint at a once-connected empire whose linguistic unity fractured as history was rewritten. Tradition adds another layer to the puzzle. Accounts from European travelers describe Tartarian peoples as skilled in horsemanship, archery, and survival in extreme climates, echoes of Mongol legacies. Yet they also speak of elaborate festivals, music with haunting string instruments, and rituals tied to the cycles of the stars. The descriptions suggest a culture that was both practical and mystical, rooted in the harshness of the steppes, yet elevated by traditions that connected them to the cosmos. Perhaps most striking are the records of spirituality. While Islam spread widely across Central Asia and Buddhism influenced the eastern Tartarian lands, many accounts also note ancient shamanistic practices. Travelers describe rituals involving fire, drums, and trance, with shamans said to communicate with the spirit world and guide their communities. Some researchers interpret these as remnants of an even older worldview, one that predated organized religion and linked Tartaria's people to a universal cosmic order. Conspiracy researchers go further. They argue that these traditions, coupled with shared linguistic roots, point to an advanced culture whose wisdom was obscured. They see evidence of lost knowledge in architecture, astronomy, and oral traditions that mainstream history dismisses as coincidence. Could the languages of Tartaria have once been branches of a common tongue, erased by political conquest? Could its traditions reflect not just folklore, but the remnants of a worldview that threatened the narratives of rising empires? The tragedy is that so little remains. Where Rome left Latin and China preserved its dynastic scripts, Tartaria left only fragments, half-forgotten dialects, scattered customs, and memories buried beneath Russian, Chinese, and Central Asian histories. What remains feels like a puzzle missing most of its pieces, leaving only the faint suggestion of what once was. And this is what fuels the mystery. If Tartaria's languages and traditions were so diverse, why were they so consistently described under a single name? And if no empire existed, why does the shadow of unity appear again and again in the accounts of those who encountered its people? The voices of Tartaria may have been silenced, but the faint echoes of their language and traditions remain, haunting reminders of a civilization that refuses to vanish entirely. If there was truly a great empire called Tartaria, then its strength would not only be measured by the vastness of its geography or the resilience of its people, but also by the networks that connected it to the rest of the world. Trade is the lifeblood of empires, and in this respect Tartaria becomes even more fascinating. For the maps and travel accounts suggest that its lands were not isolated wilderness, but crossroads where caravans, merchants, and cultures intersected. Consider the Silk Road, that ancient artery of commerce running from China through Central Asia to the Middle East and Europe. Much of its northern branches passed directly through the territories labeled as Tartaria. Caravans of silk, spices, metals, and ceramics would have traversed Tartarian lands, guarded by horsemen and passing through fortified outposts. The empire's geography, stretching across the Eurasian steppe, placed it in the perfect position to control these routes. But the trade of Tartaria was not limited to overland journeys. Some old accounts suggest influence reaching as far as Siberia's rivers and even toward the Arctic and Pacific coasts. Imagine furs from the north, salt and metals from the Ural Mountains, horses and livestock from the steppes, and fabrics and tea arriving from the east. These would have made Tartaria not just a middle ground, but a true hub of exchange between civilizations. The cultural influence of this trade cannot be understated. Where goods travel, ideas travel too. Records hint at influences in architecture, with domes and star-shaped forts appearing in lands far from one another. Musical instruments, myths, and even languages seem to carry echoes of a shared heritage. In some ways, Tartaria's influence may have been less about direct political control and more about acting as a bridge, a network that tied East and West together long before modern globalization. And yet, here is where the puzzle emerges once more. If Tartaria sat astride such vital trade routes, why does its name vanish so completely from later histories? Why do we speak of the Mongol Empire or the Russian expansion, but not of Tartaria's role in connecting worlds? Could it be that the very success of these trade routes made it a target for conquest and suppression? Control of commerce has always been the prize of empires. To erase Tartaria from history would be to erase its claim as a former master of these networks. Alternative historians suggest that Tartaria's wealth and influence threatened the narratives of rising European and Russian powers. By the 19th century, when Russia dominated Central Asia and Siberia, it became convenient to paint these lands as barren, uncivilized, waiting for empire. The memory of a powerful trade-based civilization would have contradicted that narrative. And so its name was removed from maps, its role in global exchange quietly buried. Whether Tartaria was a political empire or a cultural network, its place on the Silk Road ensured that it mattered. Its people were not merely nomads wandering the steppe, they were gatekeepers of the flow of goods, knowledge, and power. To forget Tartaria is to forget the very crossroads of Eurasia, and perhaps that is why some insist it was erased. To reconstruct Tartaria, we must look not only at maps and encyclopedias, but also at the voices of outsiders who claim to have encountered it. Their accounts are fragmentary, often contradictory, but together they create a strange tapestry of impressions, glimpses of an empire that now lives more in whispers than in official history. European travelers, merchants, and missionaries of the early modern period describe the Tartars in ways that reflect both fascination and fear. Some saw them as heirs to the Mongols, fierce horsemen who could traverse vast distances with uncanny speed. Others spoke of organized settlements, markets bustling with goods from China, Persia, and even Europe, suggesting that Tartaria was not simply a land of nomads, but a node of commerce and culture. To outsiders, Tartaria seemed both familiar and alien, a land where the known world blurred into the unknown. Jesuit missionaries, particularly those who journeyed through China in the 17th and 18th centuries, often wrote of Chinese Tartary. They described Manchuria and regions north of the Great Wall as rich, fertile lands, governed by local rulers, yet deeply tied to Chinese politics. These accounts often highlight advanced agricultural practices and vibrant local traditions. For the Jesuits, Tartaria was not a wasteland, but a region of complexity and value, one worthy of conversion and study. Russian explorers told a different story. As Moscow pushed eastward into Siberia, their reports painted Tartaria as a frontier to be conquered, a land of scattered tribes and untamed wilderness. Yet even here, contradictions emerge. Some Russian accounts describe formidable fortresses and cities, evidence of organized societies rather than random nomads. Others note the resilience of the people, their ability to endure brutal winters with knowledge outsiders could barely comprehend. For outsiders further west, the French, the English, the Dutch, Tartaria was often a canvas for imagination. In travelogues and philosophical texts, it was depicted as a vast and mysterious empire at the edge of the known world, sometimes exoticized, sometimes demonized. Enlightenment writers, fascinated by the idea of a noble savage, often projected onto Tartaria their own theories of civilization and barbarism. To them, it was both a warning and a wonder, a reminder that there were lands outside Europe's grasp, populated by peoples whose histories were not yet written in European books. But here lies the deeper enigma. If so many outsiders wrote of Tartaria, its lands, its rulers, its customs, why does modern history insist it never truly existed as an empire? Were these travelers embellishing their accounts to captivate audiences back home, or were they glimpsing fragments of a reality that was later erased? The testimony of outsiders does not give us certainty. Instead, it deepens the mystery. It suggests that Tartaria was real enough to be described in detail, yet elusive enough to vanish without a trace. Seen through the eyes of strangers, the empire emerges as a shadow, both present and absent, acknowledged and denied. And it is this tension between what outsiders recorded and what we are told to forget that keeps the question of Tartaria alive. If Tartaria was ever real, then its greatest legacy may not be in books or maps, but in the stones that still stand around us. Structures so vast, so ornate, and so far beyond the abilities of their supposed builders that they raise unsettling questions. For many researchers of hidden history, the cathedrals, towers, and monumental buildings scattered across the world are not simply relics of medieval Europe or Tsarist Russia, but echoes of the lost empire of Tartaria. Consider the towering cathedrals of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and across Eastern Europe. Their onion domes, dazzling mosaics, and impossible spires defy the crude tools we are told were available at the time. The official story credits them to the labor of peasants under Tsars, architects trained by Italians, or master builders sponsored by churches. But how, conspiracy theorists ask, could illiterate societies with wooden villages have produced such stone marvels? The contradiction is startling. Mud huts on one street, and on the next, a soaring cathedral that rivals anything in Rome. This pattern repeats across the globe. Towers rise in places where local history gives no explanation for their construction. The so-called impossible towers, with perfectly symmetrical arches, massive stone blocks, and intricate details carved with mathematical precision, look less like the work of struggling pre-industrial societies and more like the remnants of advanced architectural knowledge. Were these truly built by the nations who claim them, or inherited from a forgotten civilization whose mastery we no longer comprehend. Take the example of Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg, completed in the early 19th century. Officially, it was modeled after St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. But the sheer scale of the building, with its sweeping colonnades and dome, seems incongruous with Russia's state of development at the time. Some argue that these buildings were not constructed from scratch, but repurposed, remnants of Tartaria, stripped of their original meaning, and renamed as symbols of new empires. The mystery deepens when we consider the strange similarities across continents. The domes and towers of Russia, the star-shaped fortresses of Europe, the grand capitals of America, all share design motifs that appear suspiciously universal. Mainstream history explains this through architectural influence and imitation. But alternative researchers argue that such similarity may point to a single architectural tradition, the fingerprint of Tartaria, scattered and disguised as national styles. These cathedrals and towers also raise a technological question. The precision of their stonework, the sheer size of their columns, and the speed with which some were allegedly completed suggest techniques far beyond hand tools and horse-drawn carts. Where are the records of the scaffolding, the quarries, the years of labor? For many of these structures, there are none, just the finished product, presented as if it had always been there. In this light, the grand cathedrals and impossible towers become more than monuments. They are silent witnesses standing defiantly against the narrative of history. They whisper of a time when a different power ruled, when architectural knowledge was more advanced than we are led to believe, and when Tartaria might have been more than just a name erased from maps. If Tartaria left us a message, it may not be in books, but in stone. And those stones still stand, daring us to ask, who really built them, and why were their builders erased? If cathedrals and towers are the most visible monuments linked to Tartaria, then the star forts are its most enigmatic signature. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and even the Americas, these massive geometric fortresses appear with astonishing precision. Built in the shape of stars, with sharp bastions radiating out in perfect symmetry, they look less like medieval defenses and more like advanced blueprints of military engineering, as though drawn with mathematical tools we associate with the modern era. Mainstream history attributes these forts to Renaissance and Enlightenment military architects who supposedly designed them to withstand cannon fire. Known as bastion forts or tres Italiennes, they were said to be the natural evolution of castle design in the gunpowder age. But here is the first contradiction. Star forts are found not only in Italy or France, but also in Siberia, India, North America, and even remote corners of Africa, sometimes in places where European powers allegedly had little presence when the forts were built. How could a single architectural style spread so far, with such consistency, in so short a time? And why do so many of these forts appear centuries older than their official dates of construction? Consider the case of the Kronstadt forts near St. Petersburg. Rising from the waters of the Baltic, they are perfect examples of geometric star forts, their sharp lines and angled bastions designed with a sophistication that seems out of place for early 18th century Russia. Officially, they were built under Peter the Great. But conspiracy researchers argue they may have been inherited, remnants of Tartarian engineering, repurposed by new rulers to claim ownership of structures they could never have created themselves. Then there is the strange presence of star forts in North America, like Fort McHenry in Baltimore or Fort Ticonderoga in New York. The official narrative credits European colonists with bringing the design across the Atlantic. Yet some of these forts appear in regions supposedly undeveloped at the time, raising questions about whether they predated colonization, belonging instead to an earlier, forgotten civilization. Even more puzzling is the scale. Many star forts are enormous, requiring vast labor, precise planning, and advanced surveying techniques. Yet records of their construction are often vague or non-existent. How could societies struggling with basic infrastructure suddenly produce colossal geometries that align with mathematical precision? Alternative researchers see the forts not merely as military defenses, but as something more mysterious, energy structures. Their radiating star shapes, when viewed from above, resemble circuitry or resonant patterns. Could these have been designed not just to repel armies, but to harness natural forces, channel sound, or resonate with the Earth itself? Mainstream historians scoff at such claims, but the uncanny perfection of these designs continues to inspire speculation. The mystery of the star forts lies not just in their form, but in their silence. Who built them? When were they truly erected? And why do they appear across the world with the same uncanny symmetry? If Tartaria ever existed, the star forts may be its signature, monuments too advanced for their time, scattered across continents, whispering of a global civilization erased from memory. Perhaps the star forts are not remnants of isolated builders, but the fingerprints of Tartaria itself, still etched into the earth. Walk through the heart of St. Petersburg, gaze up at the Kremlin in Moscow, or look across the capitals of Europe and even America, and a curious pattern emerges. Monumental buildings crowned with vast domes, topped by slender spires, punctuate the skyline. At first glance, they are religious or governmental symbols, monuments to power. But for many researchers of hidden history, they may also be clues, architectural remnants of Tartaria, designed not just for beauty or faith, but for function. Domes and spires are not unique to one region or culture, yet their proliferation during the centuries when Tartaria supposedly existed is striking. Orthodox churches with golden onion domes, cathedrals with soaring spires, state buildings crowned by massive rotundas, all share a curious resemblance. They are elegant, yes, but also curiously uniform, repeating across continents and regimes. Why should Russia, Western Europe, and even the newly built United States all suddenly adopt similar monumental forms? The energy theory proposes a startling answer. According to this alternative view, domes and spires were not mere decoration, but instruments, architectural technologies designed to capture, channel, or resonate with natural energy fields. The domes, with their curved surfaces, could concentrate atmospheric electricity, while the spires acted as antennas, grounding or distributing that energy. In this light, these buildings were not simply churches or capitals, but power stations of a forgotten world. Mainstream history dismisses such claims, attributing domes to aesthetics and acoustics, and spires to architectural fashion. Yet unanswered questions linger. How did societies with limited access to advanced machinery raise such colossal domes? Why are construction records often missing or vague? And why do many of these structures resemble one another so closely, despite supposedly belonging to very different cultural traditions? Consider the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C., with its monumental dome and spire-like lantern. Officially, it was modeled on St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. But why replicate the same form on another continent in a supposedly new republic? Or take the Taj Mahal with its central dome flanked by slender spire-like minarets, officially a Mughal mausoleum, but also fitting neatly into the dome and spire pattern. Across the globe, from Eastern Orthodox cathedrals to Western capitals, the same shapes repeat, as though following a hidden blueprint. Conspiracy researchers link this blueprint to Tartaria, suggesting that what we now see as symbols of religion or empire are actually repurposed structures. The story goes that after the fall of Tartaria, new rulers claimed these buildings, erased their true functions, and rededicated them as churches, palaces, or government halls. In doing so, the original purpose, perhaps as energy centers, was lost. Is this fanciful speculation or a clue to something we have forgotten? If the energy theory is true, then Tartaria may not just have been an empire of land, but an empire of knowledge, one that harnessed the natural forces of the world in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. Domes and spires remain, towering above us, silent yet suggestive. To most, they are monuments of faith and power. But to those who search the shadows of history, they are whispers of Tartaria's lost technology, still standing in plain sight. If Tartaria's fingerprints can be seen in cathedrals, towers, and star forts, then perhaps its strangest echoes appear in the great world fairs of the 19th and early 20th centuries. To most, these fairs were celebrations of modern progress, temporary showcases of industry and culture. But to researchers of hidden history, they are evidence of something far more mysterious, the sudden borrowing of Tartarian architecture on a massive scale. The expositions dazzled millions of visitors with monumental palaces, domes, and colonnades that looked as though they belonged to a forgotten empire. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893, also known as the Columbian Exposition, is one of the most famous examples. Visitors wandered through the so-called White City, a collection of enormous neoclassical buildings that appeared overnight, with domes, arches, and towers rivaling those of Rome or Constantinople. Officially, they were temporary structures, built quickly with plaster and wood, designed to impress and then be torn down. But here is the puzzle. Could such massive, ornate buildings really have been built in just 2 years, only to be demolished immediately after? Photographs from these fairs show cities within cities, complete with canals, electric lighting, and monumental architecture. To conspiracy researchers, the story of temporary plaster palaces rings hollow. They argue that many of these structures were not built at all, but repurposed remnants of Tartaria, existing architecture dressed up and rebranded as temporary showcases of modern ingenuity. The fairs, in this theory, were less about celebrating the future and more about reintroducing the architecture of the past under a new narrative. The pattern repeats elsewhere. The Paris Exposition of 1900, the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904, and others across Europe and America featured the same monumental styles: domes, spires, colonnades, and towers on scales supposedly impossible for temporary construction. Each time, the official story insists these were plaster facades, built quickly and destroyed after the fair. Yet the photographs show a different story: vast boulevards, intricate carvings, and infrastructure that appears far too advanced to be mere stage sets. What makes the mystery deeper is the uniformity of style. Across continents, these expositions displayed buildings that looked eerily similar, as though following a global blueprint. Mainstream history explains this through the popularity of the Beaux-Arts architectural style. But alternative researchers see it as something else: the recycling of Tartarian architecture, disguised as temporary wonders, and then conveniently destroyed before questions could be asked. The idea that world fairs were cover-ups may sound outrageous, but the symbolism is compelling. Imagine inheriting a world filled with grand structures left by a forgotten empire. How do you explain them? You cannot admit they were there before. So you stage an exposition, declare them temporary, and tear them down, or claim you did, while some buildings remain, rebranded as libraries, museums, or government halls. World fairs, then, become not celebrations of modernity, but funerals for Tartaria, the final erasure of its architecture, paraded before the public one last time before being buried in official history. Were these truly temporary plaster palaces, or the last glimpses of a forgotten empire's grandeur? The photographs, with their impossible scale and uncanny beauty, continue to whisper a troubling possibility: that the world fairs were less about invention and more about rewriting memory. When we gaze at the colossal cathedrals, star forts, and domes scattered across continents, a startling question arises. Were these buildings the product of societies no more advanced than their neighbors, or were they the remnants of a civilization with knowledge beyond what we credit to their age? Could Tartaria, if it truly existed, have been more advanced than the history books allow us to believe? Mainstream history insists otherwise. It tells us these were the works of artisans, masons, and rulers who, with grit and time, raised these monuments stone by stone. Yet the scale and speed of construction recorded in some cases beggar belief. Structures allegedly erected in mere decades rivaled the output of modern machinery. How could societies with wooden tools, horse-drawn carts, and limited engineering achieve what even we today would struggle to replicate? The energy theory of Tartarian architecture provides one possible answer. Proponents suggest that the domes, spires, and symmetrical layouts of many grand structures were not just aesthetic choices, but technologies designed to harness natural forces like atmospheric electricity, sound resonance, or even telluric currents flowing beneath the earth. In this view, Tartaria may have mastered free energy, channeling the environment itself to power its cities and sustain its people. Skeptics argue that this is fantasy, that such claims are born from misinterpretations of architectural symbolism. But there are troubling details: reports of ancient cities lit without obvious sources of fuel, legends of structures that hummed with energy, and the uncanny similarity of buildings across regions supposedly unconnected. Were these coincidences or remnants of a forgotten science? The possibility that Tartaria was technologically advanced also casts new light on the mystery of its disappearance. If such a civilization existed, one capable of feats of architecture and energy we still struggle to comprehend, why would its memory be erased so thoroughly? Was it simply lost to time, or deliberately suppressed to make way for new empires and new narratives of human progress? After all, the idea of a lost civilization more advanced than ourselves challenges the very foundation of history as it is taught. Some researchers point to the mud flood theory as a clue. According to this controversial idea, much of Tartaria's infrastructure was buried under layers of earth during a cataclysmic event in the 18th or 19th century. Photographs of buildings with windows sunk below ground level, or entire streets discovered beneath modern cities, are cited as evidence. If true, it would mean not only that Tartaria was more advanced, but that its destruction was sudden, and its memory intentionally rewritten in the aftermath. Could Tartaria have been more advanced? The question hangs heavy. Perhaps it is nothing more than speculation, fueled by coincidence and imagination. But perhaps it is the whisper of something deeper, a civilization that harnessed forces we no longer understand, whose legacy we still walk through unknowingly, and whose silence in the record is itself the loudest clue. If the architecture of Tartaria really shouldn't exist, then maybe that's because it belonged to a world we have forgotten, one erased from memory, but still standing all around us. Among the strangest and most controversial claims linked to the mystery of Tartaria is the so-called mud flood theory, the idea that much of the empire's architecture, and perhaps the empire itself, was buried under a sudden and catastrophic layer of earth. The theory suggests that a global cataclysm, sometime in the 18th or 19th century, covered cities in mud, wiping away whole societies and leaving only fragments behind. For mainstream historians, this is fringe speculation. But the evidence that fuels it is hauntingly visible in cities across the world. Look closely at photographs from the late 19th century, images of buildings in Europe, Russia, Asia, and even America. Again and again, we see the same strange detail, windows and doorways sunk below ground level. Grand facades appear half-buried, their lower stories hidden beneath the street. In many cases, excavations have revealed entire floors underground, complete with doorways, fireplaces, and architectural details clearly designed to be used, not meant to sit in darkness beneath the earth. Why would anyone build windows that face into dirt, or doors that open into nothing? Mainstream explanations range from changes in street levels to later renovations that altered the original ground line. Yet the sheer scale of this phenomenon makes these answers feel incomplete. From Paris to St. Petersburg, from Chicago to Istanbul, buildings across continents share the same eerie feature, half-buried lower floors as though the earth itself rose up to swallow them. Researchers of hidden history argue that this cannot be coincidence. Instead, they propose that a massive flood of mud, whether caused by natural disaster, liquefaction, or some unknown event, swept across vast regions of the world, burying entire cities. The upper stories of buildings remained visible and were repurposed, while the buried levels were forgotten, written off as basements or foundations. In this theory, what we call the Old World was not destroyed by war or decay, but entombed in an instant by a catastrophe that erased Tartaria. There are accounts, too, of mysterious excavations during the 19th century. In some cases, entire neighborhoods were dug out, revealing lower levels of buildings long hidden. Newspapers of the time occasionally mention buried cities discovered beneath modern streets. Yet these reports are rarely followed up, and mainstream narratives simply dismiss them as anomalies. What makes the mud flood theory compelling to some is its global scope. It is not just one city or one country. It is a repeating pattern, scattered across continents, as though something universal took place. And this raises disturbing questions. Was there truly a global disaster in the last few centuries, one we no longer remember? Or is the mud flood a metaphor for something else, a deliberate burying of history itself, where forgotten layers were not only covered by earth, but by silence? The half-buried buildings remain. They are there for anyone to see, silent, stubborn, and unexplained. And each one asks the same question: what lies beneath our feet, and why has it been forgotten? Walk down the old streets of Paris, Prague, or St. Petersburg, and if you look closely, you'll notice a detail most passers-by ignore: rows of windows half buried in the ground. Some are bricked up, others peer out from basements, and many sit below modern street level as though the earth has swallowed the first floor of the building. These are the sunken windows, one of the most persistent pieces of evidence cited by those who believe in the mud flood theory. At first glance, the explanation seems obvious. Historians say that city streets were raised over time, new paving laid over old layers to combat flooding, improve drainage, or modernize infrastructure. In this view, the sunken windows are simply basement levels, never meant to be fully exposed. But the scale of the phenomenon raises unsettling questions. Why would so many buildings across so many cities feature ornate windows and detailed stonework below ground, elements that would never have been intended for hidden basements? Why design decoration where no one was supposed to see it? Take St. Petersburg, often cited as a focal point of the mud flood mystery. Photographs from the 19th century show grand palaces and government buildings with rows of windows at street level, and then, strangely, additional windows peering out from beneath the earth. In some cases, entire doorways are half buried, their arches visible only above the soil. If these were truly basements, why do they resemble normal floors, complete with fireplaces and doorways leading to nowhere? The same can be seen in Paris, where narrow streets reveal facades with half-sunken windows, as though the city rests on top of an earlier one. Excavations during subway construction uncovered older layers of streets and structures buried beneath the modern city, remnants that fuel suspicion of something larger than simple urban renovation. Even in America, far from the supposed heart of Tartaria, we find similar anomalies. Old photographs of Chicago and San Francisco show windows and doors partially buried by the earth. After the great fires of the 19th century, many cities were rebuilt, yet beneath the new streets, lower levels of old buildings were revealed, leading some to speculate whether those fires were cover stories for a much older catastrophe. For believers in the mud flood theory, these sunken windows are not architectural quirks. They are scars, visible evidence that a sudden catastrophe blanketed cities in layers of earth and mud. The first floors became basements, the second floors became the ground level, and the original ground vanished from memory. Instead of rebuilding from scratch, society simply adapted, bricking up windows and calling them cellars. But if this was the case, what caused it? A natural disaster on a global scale? Massive flooding and liquefaction? Or something even stranger, a deliberate burying of a previous world order? Whatever the explanation, the sunken windows remain, staring out at us from the shadows of history. Silent, half-buried eyes that suggest we are walking not on the first floors of our cities, but on the ruins of an older civilization, perhaps Tartaria itself. If the buried buildings and sunken windows are to be believed, then something catastrophic must have happened, not in the distant past, but shockingly close to our own modern era. The mud flood theory points again and again to the 19th century as the time of upheaval, a century that, on the surface, is remembered for industrial progress, empire building, and scientific discovery. But was it also a century of silence, concealing a disaster that reshaped the world? The 19th century is full of odd gaps and curious events that feed into the mud flood narrative. Fires that swept through major cities, the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871, the San Francisco Fire following the 1906 earthquake, or repeated blazes in European capitals, all destroyed vast swaths of architecture. Officially, these fires were tragic, but natural accidents. Yet conspiracy researchers suggest they serve another purpose, to explain away sudden rebuilding or to cover evidence of an older civilization buried beneath. Then there are the photographs. With the birth of photography in the mid-1800s, we should have a clear, continuous record of our cities. And yet, the earliest photos often show eerily empty streets, grand monumental buildings towering over cities that seem half-deserted, and construction projects that look more like excavations than new builds. Was this simply the way early photography worked, with long exposure times avoiding people in motion? Or were cities genuinely emptier than we are told, repopulate after catastrophe? Some point to the so-called reset events of 19th century. The year without a summer in 1816, caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora, plunged much of the world into famine and strange weather. But was this just one natural disaster among many? Earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions, and unexplained climatic shifts pepper the records of the 19th century. Could these have been part of a broader pattern, a global upheaval that buried cities in mud and forced nations to start over? What makes this idea compelling is not just the anomalies themselves, but the timing. The 19th century was also when Tartaria's name vanished from maps and encyclopedias. It was when new empires, Russia, Britain, France, and the United States, expanded their reach and wrote their histories. Could the disappearance of Tartaria and the sudden surge of catastrophic fires and rebuildings be connected? Was the 19th century not just the dawn of modernity, but the deliberate erasure of an older world? Mainstream historians argue these connections are illusions, coincidences stitched together by those hungry for a grand conspiracy. But the mud flood theory persists because the visual evidence remains: photographs of buried buildings, reports of strange excavations, and entire cities that seem to have been built on the ruins of something older. If a cataclysm did occur in the 19th century, it would not only explain the buried architecture, but also the silence of Tartaria. A disaster, natural or engineered, may have provided the perfect excuse to wipe the slate clean, bury the past, and usher in a new world order under modern empires. The question is not whether the 19th century had disasters. That much is fact. The question is whether those disasters were the final blow to a forgotten empire. History is usually told in books, but the mud flood mystery insists that we look not at words, but at images and testimonies that survived the 19th century. Eyewitness accounts and old photographs form one of the strongest pillars of this strange theory, silent records that hint at a catastrophe buried beneath the narrative of progress. When photography emerged in the mid-1800s, it offered, for the first time, the chance to capture cities as they were. Yet these photographs reveal something unsettling. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, we see grand buildings standing tall but surrounded by scenes that look less like thriving metropolises and more like excavation sites. Streets are unpaved, mud seems to fill the ground, and men are pictured digging out doorways and windows half buried in the earth. If these buildings were truly constructed fresh, why do so many photos appear to show them being unearthed rather than built? One striking example comes from St. Petersburg, often called the jewel of the Russian Empire. In early photographs, workers stand before monumental palaces where the lower levels are visibly caked in earth, windows covered to their arches. Was this simply the city struggling with swampy terrain, as official history tells us? Or were these workers digging out structures that had already been engulfed by mud? Eyewitness accounts from the 19th century add more intrigue. Newspapers from America and Europe occasionally reported discoveries of buried streets or forgotten basements during urban construction. In one Chicago report, engineers described finding entire levels of buildings hidden beneath the city, complete with functional windows and ornate stonework. Such details are easily explained by changes in street level, but the consistency of these discoveries across continents makes skeptics wonder if the past was more complex. The Paris archives reveal a similar puzzle. Photographs from the late 1800s show neighborhoods where men dig trenches through mud that nearly reaches the second-story windows of elegant townhouses. Official records call these works urban improvements, part of the city's modernization. But the photos themselves whisper another possibility, that the workers were uncovering buildings already swallowed by earth, remnants of a catastrophe that the history books ignore. Skeptics argue that photography exaggerates these images. Long exposures meant empty streets, and muddy conditions were common before modern paving. But proponents of the mud flood theory insist these details are not incidental. They see a pattern: buildings not being constructed but being revealed, streets not simply muddy but unnaturally raised, and eyewitnesses describing buried cities without realizing the scale of what they were witnessing. What makes these accounts and photos so haunting is their silence. They don't scream conspiracy, nor do they claim catastrophe outright. They simply exist, fragments of a forgotten world. And in that silence, believers find their evidence, proof that the mud flood was real, that cities were buried, and that the story of Tartaria's disappearance is written not in books, but in the dirt that still clings to old stone walls. Could these photos and testimonies be coincidences, artifacts of urban growth and industrial chaos? Or are they accidental glimpses of a global cataclysm we were never meant to remember? The mud flood theory is strange enough when viewed as an unexplained natural disaster. But when placed against the backdrop of Tartaria, it becomes far more unsettling. Could it be that the event, whether cataclysm, deliberate reset, or something in between, was the very thing that erased Tartaria from history? The theory suggests this. Tartaria was not a vague, undefined landmass, as mainstream history tells us, but a vast empire with advanced architecture, technology, and culture. If such a civilization truly existed, how could it vanish so completely within just a century? The answer, some argue, lies beneath our feet. A flood of earth and mud, sudden, devastating, and global in scope, may have buried its cities, suffocated its infrastructure, and reduced its surviving population to scattered remnants. In this view, the mud flood was not just a catastrophe, but a reset. The buried buildings we see today, windows beneath the ground, entire floors swallowed by soil, are not quirks of construction, but the silent tombstones of an erased civilization. Cities we walk through daily, from Paris to St. Petersburg to Chicago, may be built upon the skeleton of Tartaria itself. The timing is compelling. The 19th century is when the flood evidence appears most prominently in photographs and when encyclopedias quietly remove Tartary from their pages. Is also when new empires, Russia, Britain, and the United States, consolidated power across regions once marked as Tartaria. If a natural disaster wiped the empire from existence, these rising powers may have seized the chance to rewrite history, claiming conquered lands as their own and erasing Tartaria from memory. But what if the mud flood was not natural? Some suggest it was engineered, either through unexplained technology or as the aftermath of warfare unlike anything we record today. Stories of liquefaction, unexplained earth movements, and buried cities hint at forces we still do not understand. Could Tartaria's downfall have been deliberate, a civilization targeted for erasure, with the flood both the weapon and the cover-up? Skeptics dismiss these ideas, pointing instead to mundane causes, street-level adjustments, city fires, and inconsistent record-keeping. Yet the consistency of buried buildings across continents nags at the curious mind. If it happened in one city, we could call it an anomaly. But if it happened everywhere, then what we face is not coincidence, but a pattern. Perhaps the most chilling possibility is this. The mud flood did not just erase Tartaria, but it erased our memory of Tartaria. The survivors may have been absorbed into the new world order, their culture and knowledge scattered, their architecture repurposed or destroyed. The rest was buried, literally and figuratively, beneath the mud. Could the flood have erased Tartaria? The evidence suggests it may have. And if that is true, then every time we walk down a street lined with sunken windows, we may be walking across the graves of a forgotten empire. For centuries, the maps of Europe and Asia carried a strange name across their northern frontiers, Tartaria. Sometimes vast and sprawling across Siberia and Central Asia, sometimes fragmented into Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, or Independent Tartary, the name appeared again and again, printed by geographers, cartographers, and explorers alike. It was not a vague or passing label. It was a defining feature of the world's geography, as real as the Ottoman Empire or the Holy Roman Empire. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. By the mid-19th century, the word Tartaria begins to vanish from maps. Atlases that once shaded entire continents under its name quietly replace it with Siberia, Mongolia, or Russian Empire. Encyclopedias that had described Tartaria in detail now erase it completely, their entries revised to speak instead of the growing dominance of European powers. Within a generation, an empire that once covered a fifth of the globe had evaporated, not by conquest or war, but by omission. This disappearance raises troubling questions. How could a region so vast, recognized in official records and maps for centuries, simply vanish from record? Mainstream historians offer a straightforward answer. Tartaria was never an empire, only a label used by Europeans to describe unknown lands inhabited by nomadic peoples. As exploration advanced and Russia consolidated control, the term fell out of use, replaced by more precise geographical names. Yet for researchers of hidden history, this explanation feels unsatisfying. The old maps and encyclopedias do not treat Tartaria as a vague, unknown wilderness. They list its subdivisions, describe its climate, resources, and even populations with confidence. They speak of it as a place with an identity, not a blank space filled with guesswork. And then, without any dramatic collapse or recorded conquest, it ceases to exist. The timing of this disappearance is also suspicious. It coincides almost exactly with the so-called mud flood anomalies of the 19th century and the rise of world powers eager to expand into Central Asia and Siberia. Could it be that Tartaria did not simply fade from language, but was actively erased from memory, its lands absorbed by Russia, China, and others, its history rewritten to fit the New World Order? Cartographic evidence adds to the mystery. Compare an 18th century atlas to one published a century later, and the contrast is stark. The once massive label of Tartaria, stretching across Eurasia, has been fragmented into smaller, more familiar terms. The silence is not gradual but sudden, as though the world agreed all at once to forget. For those who believe in the lost empire, this is no accident. It is a cover-up, a quiet rewriting of history to ensure that no trace of Tartaria remained except in half-buried windows and photographs of forgotten ruins. Was Tartaria truly just a cartographic placeholder, or was it an empire deliberately struck from the pages of history? The maps tell us it was there. The absence tells us someone wanted it gone. If maps were the first to betray Tartaria, encyclopedias were the next. In the 18th century, encyclopedic entries treated Tartaria as a real place, described with the same detail and certainty as France, Spain, or China. The Encyclopedia Britannica of 1771, for example, dedicates pages to Tartary, outlining its divisions, climate, and even its people. It speaks of Great Tartary stretching across Siberia, Chinese Tartary near the Great Wall, and independent Tartary in Central Asia. The tone is not speculative, it is confident, as if describing a recognized world power. But by the mid-19th century, these entries begin to change. Later editions of the same encyclopedias quietly erase the name Tartaria, replacing it with the Russian Empire, Mongolia, or Siberia. What was once an expansive empire is suddenly fragmented into territories claimed by new nations. And just like the maps, the encyclopedias offer no explanation for the shift. There is no record of a war of annihilation, no treaty of dissolution, no revolution that toppled Tartaria from within. Instead, the name is simply gone, like smoke in the wind. Why did this change occur? Mainstream historians argue it was the natural evolution of knowledge. In earlier centuries, European scholars wrote from second-hand accounts, relying on travelers, merchants, and rumors. Tartary was, in this view, a vague catch-all for lands beyond their understanding. As explorers charted Siberia, and as Russia pushed deeper into Asia, the word Tartary became obsolete. To scholars, updating encyclopedias was simply the process of refining error into accuracy. But this explanation does not satisfy everyone. To researchers who see Tartaria as more than a placeholder, the vanishing act looks deliberate. Why, they ask, would an encyclopedia describe in detail the culture, geography, and divisions of a place if it were nothing but hearsay? And why would that description be erased so abruptly without acknowledgement or correction notes? If it was a mistake, why not admit the mistake instead of quietly rewriting the record? Some suggest that the disappearance of Tartaria from encyclopedias mirrors a broader effort to rewrite history in the 19th century. This was a time when empires like Russia and Britain were consolidating territory, redrawing borders, and claiming dominion over lands once attributed to Tartaria. To maintain legitimacy, they needed the world to forget that another civilization might have existed there. By erasing Tartaria from reference works, they replaced a vast empire with their own names, their own narratives. Others go further still, linking the change to the mud flood theory. If a cataclysm buried cities and civilizations in the 19th century, then encyclopedias would have been part of the cleanup, rewriting the story of the past to exclude what had been lost. In this sense, the shift in encyclopedia entries is not a correction of error, but the conscious burial of truth. Whatever the reason, the result is undeniable. Encyclopedias that once described Tartaria with authority later pretend it never existed. A vast empire, printed in ink and studied by scholars, vanished without a trace, except for those old editions that survived to tell a different story. Could it be that the encyclopedias changed not because they were wrong, but because the truth was no longer allowed to be remembered? The 19th century was an age of empire, ambition, and redrawing of borders, but also an age of silence, when the memory of Tartaria quietly slipped away. While maps and encyclopedias stopped naming Tartaria, the great national powers of the time were expanding into the very lands once associated with it. To some, this timing feels like coincidence. To others, it feels like strategy, the deliberate rewriting of a region's identity to serve the ambitions of new rulers. The Russian Empire was the most prominent player in this story. As the 18th century turned into the 19th, Russia extended its dominion deep into Siberia and Central Asia. Entire regions once mapped as Tartary were rebranded as Russian territory. St. Petersburg proclaimed itself the inheritor of vast lands stretching to the Pacific, absorbing cultures and peoples that older maps had marked as Tartarian. To admit that these regions once belonged to an empire of their own might have undermined Russia's claims, so the narrative shifted. Tartary was not an empire, only a name, and Russia was the rightful power of the East. Meanwhile, in the West, Britain and France were expanding their own imperial footprints. The 19th century was their golden age of colonialism, and they too had a vested interest in framing history as a march of progress under European leadership. The idea of a forgotten Eurasian empire, technologically sophisticated and independent, clashed with the imperial myth of European superiority. By portraying Tartaria as nothing more than a vague label on old maps, Britain and France reinforced their narrative, that they, and they alone, were the bearers of civilization. The rising United States also played its role. In the wake of independence and westward expansion, America embraced its identity as a new world built from the ground up. Yet early maps in the U.S. also displayed Tartaria sprawling across Asia. As America aligned itself with European scholarship and imperial thought, those old maps were quietly replaced. By the late 19th century, Tartaria no longer existed in American academic or political discourse, reflecting the global consensus that the name was obsolete. This geopolitical backdrop makes the erasure of Tartaria seem less like an accident and more like a coordinated rewriting of history. As nations consolidated their territories, they consolidated narratives. What better way to strengthen legitimacy than to erase rivals, not through war but through silence? If Tartaria had been remembered as an empire, then Russia's expansion, Britain's influence, and America's rising global posture might have seemed like conquest. But if Tartaria never existed, then it was all simply the natural order of progress. For believers in the lost empire, the timing is too perfect. Tartaria disappears from encyclopedias just as Russia swallows Siberia. The mud flood anomalies appear just as photography begins to document buried buildings. And the world's rising empires cement their power by writing themselves as the only authors of modern history. The 19th century gave us railroads, steamships, and the telegraph, but perhaps it also gave us something else, the deliberate burial of a civilization that didn't fit the story. Was Tartaria erased because it never existed, or because the New World powers couldn't allow it to exist? That is the question that lingers behind every forgotten map and every altered encyclopedia page. History, we are often told, is written by the victors. But the case of Tartaria suggests something even more unsettling, that history is not only written, but rewritten, edited, and reshaped by political necessity. The 19th century was a time when empires rose to their zenith, Russia stretching deep into Asia, Britain ruling the seas, France projecting its colonial power, and America emerging as a new global force. Each of these powers had something to gain by controlling not just territory, but the narrative of what that territory once was. Consider the Russian Empire. As it pushed eastward, claiming Siberia and Central Asia, its legitimacy depended on portraying these lands as wilderness or as fragmented tribes, not as the remnants of an organized empire. If Tartaria was remembered as a sophisticated civilization with its own legacy, Russia's claim would look like conquest. But if Tartaria never truly existed, then Russia's expansion could be framed as destiny, a natural extension of its reach. The quiet disappearance of Tartaria from maps and encyclopedias served that purpose perfectly. The West had similar motivations. Britain and France were at the height of their colonial power, drawing borders across Africa and Asia. For them, history needed to reinforce a narrative of European superiority, that Europe was the center of progress, and all other lands were either primitive or waiting to be civilized. The idea of a vast Eurasian empire, potentially more advanced in architecture or technology, would have shattered that story. To maintain the myth of European leadership, Tartaria had to vanish. America, too, participated in this rewriting. As the 19th century unfolded, the United States forged its identity as a land of pioneers, building civilization from the wilderness. Yet old maps in early American libraries also carried the name Tartaria across Asia. By aligning with European academia, American historians and educators quietly adopted the same narrative, that Tartaria was nothing more than an archaic label, unworthy of recognition. In doing so, the U.S. solidified its role in the New World Order that emerged after the supposed disappearance of Tartaria. The politics of rewriting history, then, were not about correcting mistakes, but about consolidating power. Nations erased Tartaria not because it never existed, but because its existence conflicted with their vision of the future. If there had been a civilization capable of building monumental architecture, mastering unknown technologies, and spanning vast territories, then it would have demanded recognition, and possibly challenged the legitimacy of the very empires rewriting the record. This political motive also explains why the silence was so coordinated. Tartaria didn't fade away slowly, it disappeared almost at once. Maps, encyclopedias, and academic discourse all shifted in tandem. It is as though the great powers had quietly agreed to close the book on a chapter of history that no longer served their interests. What we are left with today is the shadow of that decision. The politics of the 19th century ensured that Tartaria was remembered not as an empire, but as an error. Yet the ruins, the buried buildings, and the anomalies in history's record suggest otherwise. Behind every political decision to erase the past lies a truth waiting to be rediscovered. Whenever a piece of history disappears, the first question we should ask is not only how it vanished, but who stood to gain from its disappearance. In the case of Tartaria, the erasure seems to have served the ambitions of powerful nations and the architects of a new global order in the 19th century. The Russian Empire gained most directly. By absorbing Siberia and Central Asia, Russia transformed itself from a European kingdom into a transcontinental empire stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific. If Tartaria had been remembered as a civilization in its own right, Russia's expansion might have been branded conquest, the takeover of a vast, independent culture. But by erasing Tartaria, Russia could claim it had simply tamed wilderness, filling an empty canvas rather than toppling an empire. Its legitimacy depended on silence. Western Europe benefited as well. Britain and France, in their golden age of colonialism, needed history to reinforce the myth of European supremacy. A sophisticated Tartarian empire, potentially with advanced architecture or technology, would have threatened this narrative. By rewriting Tartaria as nothing more than tribes and steppes, Britain and France ensured that Europe remained the sole source of modernity in the official record. To admit otherwise would have undercut the ideological foundation of empire, that the colonies they seized had no comparable history of greatness. The United States, too, gained from the erasure. As it expanded across its own continent and began to assert itself on the global stage, America aligned with European academia, adopting the same historical frameworks. Old maps in U.S. libraries once displayed Tartary, but these were soon replaced, in step with Britain and Russia's narrative. America, the self-proclaimed New World, could hardly allow the memory of a forgotten civilization that might have rivaled its ideals of progress. Erasing Tartaria helped reinforce the belief that history was linear, leading naturally from ancient Rome and Greece to modern Europe and America. Even academia benefited, though indirectly. By standardizing history around the narratives of nation-states, universities and historians ensured their own role as gatekeepers of knowledge. Recognizing Tartaria as an empire would have opened uncomfortable questions. How had such a power left so little trace? Why did its architecture suggest advanced knowledge? By dismissing Tartaria as a mistake, academia avoided challenges to its authority and its carefully crafted timelines. In the bigger picture, the erasure of Tartaria also served the creation of a unified historical story. A story that begins with ancient civilizations, moves through the Middle Ages, and culminates in the rise of Europe and America. Tartaria, with its sprawling size and strange anomalies, simply did not fit. Erasing it allowed history to remain tidy, progressive, and controlled. So who benefited? Russia gained land. Britain and France gained ideological dominance. America gained legitimacy. academia gained control. And we, the inheritors of this rewritten history, lost something, the memory of a civilization that may have once reshaped the world. The question lingers, if Tartaria's erasure served so many, then was it ever really an accident? Or was it one of the greatest silences in history, a silence from which the victors of the modern world still profit today? When researchers speak of a Great Reset in the context of Tartaria, they are not referring to a single war or disaster, but something far more profound, a deliberate wiping of the slate of civilization. The Great Reset hypothesis suggests that our world has undergone cycles of destruction and renewal, moments where entire civilizations are erased from memory and replaced with a new order, their history rewritten, their ruins buried, and their technologies hidden. At its core, the Great Reset is not about political revolutions or dynasties changing hands. It is about the collapse of one global narrative and the imposition of another. According to this theory, Tartaria may have been the last victim of such a reset. The mud flood, the vanishing of its name from maps, the silence of encyclopedias, and the sudden rise of new national powers all point to a moment in the 18th or 19th century when the world was forcibly rewritten. So what does a reset look like? Proponents argue it involves three stages. First comes the catastrophe, natural or engineered, that physically devastates the old order. In Tartaria's case, this could have been the mud flood, earthquakes, or other unexplained disasters of 19th century. The second stage is absorption, where surviving lands and populations are claimed by rising empires. Russia, Britain, France, and America all expanded rapidly into former Tartarian territories during this period. Finally, there is reprogramming, the rewriting of history itself. Maps updated, encyclopedias altered, and educational systems teaching the new narrative while suppressing the old. The result is not merely conquest, but the illusion that what came before never existed. The Great Reset is not just about burying cities in mud or demolishing buildings, it is about burying memory. Once the reset is complete, generations grow up never questioning why windows sit below ground level, or why old maps name places that no longer exist. The truth becomes what the victors decide it to be. Skeptics dismiss this idea as a conspiracy theory, arguing that history evolves naturally as errors are corrected and societies change. But the Great Reset hypothesis presses on a troubling point. History is not only a record of what happened, it is a tool of power. Whoever controls the past controls the present. If powerful nations decided that Tartaria needed to be forgotten, they had both the means and the motive to erase it. To believers, the concept of a Great Reset is not limited to Tartaria. They see it as part of a recurring cycle. Ancient civilizations like Atlantis, Lemuria, or the Mayans may have fallen victim to earlier resets. Tartaria is simply the most recent, erased not thousands of years ago, but only a few generations past. Could it be that our world has already been reset, its past rewritten, and that Tartaria's silence is proof of this pattern? If so, then the Great Reset hypothesis forces us to reconsider everything we know, not just about one lost empire, but about the fragility of history itself. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Great Reset hypothesis is that it doesn't see Tartaria as an isolated case. Instead, it places the forgotten empire within a broader framework, the idea that human history moves in cycles. Civilizations rise, reach heights of knowledge and power, and then collapse, often suddenly, leaving little but myths, ruins, and faint traces for the next civilization to puzzle over. We are told that history is linear, a steady climb from primitive beginnings to modern technology. Yet the evidence from ancient ruins and legends around the world suggests otherwise. Great civilizations seem to appear almost fully formed, only to vanish mysteriously. Atlantis, described by Plato as a powerful maritime empire, supposedly fell in a single cataclysm. The Indus Valley civilization built advanced cities with plumbing and grid layouts, only to fade into silence. The Mayans, with their astronomical knowledge, abandoned their monumental cities for reasons still debated. And now Tartaria, erased not in prehistory, but within the last few centuries, fits eerily into this pattern. The cycle, as theorists describe it, has stages. Growth begins with expansion, innovation, and architecture that seems to surpass what came before. Stability follows as the empire dominates and its culture flourishes. Then comes collapse, triggered by natural disasters, wars, or deliberate resets. Finally, there is forgetting, the rewriting of history, where the ruins of the old are either absorbed or attributed to the new. By the time the cycle restarts, the memory of what came before has been blurred into myth. Tartaria appears to occupy the last two stages. If the mud flood and 19th century disasters marked its collapse, then the removal of its name from maps and encyclopedias represents the forgetting. Its architecture remains half buried, its supposed technologies hinted at but denied, and its name now labeled a myth. In this way, Tartaria joins a lineage of civilizations remembered only in fragments, not because they were insignificant, but because they no longer fit the story of those who came after. The theory of cycles also explains why these resets seem global in scope. The disappearance of Tartaria was not confined to Russia or Central Asia. It rippled across Europe and even the Americas, where sunken windows and buried cities appear as well. Just as the fall of Atlantis was said to reshape the entire ancient world, so too might Tartaria's erasure have been part of a broader reset, clearing the stage for modern nations to rise. Skeptics argue that this cyclical interpretation is romantic fantasy, an attempt to impose patterns where none exist. They point out that empires fall for ordinary reasons: drought, famine, invasion, disease. But the Great Reset hypothesis insists that the repetition of these collapses, combined with the sudden amnesia of history, cannot be ignored. If civilizations fall in cycles, then we may not be unique. We may be living in the middle of another cycle, one that will one day bury parts of our own world in silence. The question becomes chillingly simple. If Tartaria was forgotten so easily, what does that say about our own civilization's place in the cycle? Could we too be standing on the edge of a reset? If the Great Reset hypothesis is more than a theory, then Tartaria might stand as its most recent casualty. The evidence, scattered across maps, encyclopedias, architecture, and unexplained disasters of the 19th century, points toward a single conclusion: that Tartaria did not simply fade into obscurity. It was reset. The timing is suspicious. Tartaria is still present in the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1771, with detailed descriptions of Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and Independent Tartary. Yet by the late 19th century, the word is gone, replaced by Russia, Siberia, and Mongolia. What happened in that century to justify the erasure of a civilization once described as vast and powerful? The Great Reset hypothesis answers: the erasure was not a correction of an error, but the intentional rewriting of a world. Architecture strengthens this suspicion. Across Europe, Asia, and even America, buildings appear older than their supposed age, monumental structures that mainstream history attributes to recent construction. Yet photographs from the 19th century often show these buildings half-buried, their lower levels filled with mud, as if unearthed rather than newly built. These mud flood anomalies suggest a catastrophic event, one that not only destroyed infrastructure, but also offered an opportunity to overwrite history. Consider the geopolitical context. The 19th century saw the rise of new empires: Russia consolidating Siberia, Britain expanding across Asia, and America forging its identity as a rising global power. Each benefited from Tartaria's absence. Each had reason to support a narrative in which Tartaria was not erased, but simply never existed. A great reset, whether natural or engineered, would have provided the perfect blank slate for these nations to claim old territories as their own. But perhaps the most compelling argument lies in the synchronization of the silence. Maps, encyclopedias, academic discourse, all shifted at once. History is rarely so coordinated. Civilizations collapse unevenly, their legacies debated for centuries. Yet Tartaria vanishes almost overnight, as though the world agreed collectively to forget. To theorists, this is the hallmark of a reset, not just destruction, but replacement, where memory itself is remodeled to fit the new order. Skeptics argue that no such reset is necessary to explain Tartaria's disappearance. They see Tartary as nothing more than a European catch-all for lands they didn't understand, discarded once knowledge improved. But this view fails to explain the sheer detail of old accounts, why encyclopedias gave Tartaria subdivisions, or why maps shaded its vast expanse so consistently. If it was nothing, why treat it as something for centuries? The Great Reset hypothesis proposes a darker answer. Tartaria was erased because it was real. It was buried, absorbed, and rewritten out of existence in the 19th century, leaving only fragments behind, strange architecture, buried windows, and the uneasy silence of history books. So, did Tartaria fall victim to a reset? If the evidence is to be believed, then yes. And that conclusion raises a chilling thought. If such a reset could happen once, who is to say it cannot happen again? If Tartaria truly fell victim to a great reset, it may not have been the first time humanity has endured such a rewriting. The theory of resets is not limited to one empire in the 19th century. Instead, it points to a pattern, a cycle of civilizations rising to extraordinary heights only to collapse suddenly, leaving behind fragments that challenge the official story. The Great Reset hypothesis argues that Tartaria was simply the most recent example of this recurring phenomenon. Take the legend of Atlantis, first described by Plato. He wrote of a highly advanced maritime civilization that wielded power across the known world before being swallowed in a single day and night of misfortune. Mainstream scholars treat Atlantis as allegory, a moral tale rather than a historical memory. Yet for centuries, explorers, mystics, and alternative researchers have wondered, what if Plato was describing a reset, a deliberate or natural catastrophe that erased a once great civilization? Then there are the ruins of Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. Archaeologists have dated the massive stone structures to nearly 12,000 years ago, long before agriculture and writing were supposed to exist. The site appears intentionally buried, as though someone covered it up for reasons we cannot understand. Was Göbekli Tepe evidence of an ancient society that survived a reset at the end of the last ice age, when the Younger Dryas cataclysm reshaped the Earth's climate and wiped out species? The Indus Valley Civilization offers another clue. Flourishing around 2000 BCE, it built planned cities with plumbing, grid layouts, and advanced trade networks. Yet it collapsed mysteriously, its script undeciphered, and its legacy largely forgotten. Why does such a sophisticated society leave so little memory compared to its contemporaries in Mesopotamia or Egypt? Could this be another instance of a reset where history's victors absorb the survivors and erase their independence? Even the Mayan civilization seems to echo this cycle. At its height, the Maya mastered astronomy, mathematics, and architecture. Then, around the 9th century, its great cities were abandoned. Mainstream theories cite drought, famine, or warfare. Yet the speed of the decline and the persistence of Mayan descendants suggest something more. A collapse sudden enough to strip away memory, but not enough to erase the people entirely. What ties these cases together is not just disappearance, but the rewriting of history afterward. Atlantis became a myth. Göbekli Tepe was buried. The Indus Valley faded into obscurity until rediscovered by archaeologists. The Mayas' legacy was reframed by Spanish conquest. And Tartaria, if it truly existed, was erased by maps, encyclopedias, and textbooks. The Great Reset hypothesis argues that these are not isolated tragedies, but deliberate or cyclical resets, moments when old civilizations are erased to make way for new ones. Each time, the survivors are left with fragments, myths, and ruins. Each time, the victors claim the narrative. If Tartaria's silence is part of this pattern, then it forces us to ask, how many civilizations have we lost to resets? And how much of what we call ancient mystery is not mystery at all, but the shattered remains of worlds we were never meant to remember? The Great Reset hypothesis does not merely look backward, it looks forward, and its most haunting suggestion is that resets are not just part of the past, but of the future. If civilizations rise and fall in cycles, and if Tartaria was one of the most recent victims, then the question becomes, is our own world next in line? Signs of fragility are all around us. Our civilization depends on vast, interconnected systems, power grids, global trade networks, digital communication, systems that, while impressive, are also perilously vulnerable. A large-scale catastrophe, whether natural or man-made, could shatter them overnight. Consider solar flares, which scientists warn could knock out satellites and electrical grids. Imagine the chaos if every digital record, including our history, suddenly disappeared. Would the survivors, generations later, even know who built the skyscrapers and machines around them? Then there is the specter of climate change and environmental collapse. In the same way that the Younger Dryas period may have brought floods that reset ancient civilizations, our world faces rising seas, extreme weather, and shifting ecosystems. If history is cyclical, then our age of abundance may be the precursor to a collapse. Future generations could inherit ruins and fragments, wondering what happened to us, just as we wonder about Tartaria. War adds another layer of risk. Nuclear arsenals, capable of wiping out entire nations, hang like a sword over modern civilization. If unleashed, they could erase entire regions, rewriting borders in an instant. And, as the Tartaria case suggests, history is written by the victors. If our world descended into chaos, would the survivors craft a new narrative, one that silences our present just as Tartaria's past was silenced? Some researchers point to suspicious parallels. The 19th century, when Tartaria supposedly disappeared, was marked by revolutions, industrial upheavals, and unexplained disasters. Today, we live through our own upheavals: rapid technological change, political polarization, pandemics, and mysterious anomalies in climate and geology. Could these be early signs of another reset? Even culture itself hints at preparation. The idea of a Great Reset has entered mainstream discussion in economics and politics, framed as a restructuring of the global system. For conspiracy theorists, this is chilling. Is modern talk of a Great Reset an echo of something far older, a cycle in which the world is deliberately cleared, reordered, and renamed? To believers, the possibility is not hypothetical. They argue that the signs, unstable climate, global tensions, fragile infrastructure, and growing centralization of power, all point toward an approaching shift. If Tartaria was reset little more than a century ago, then our own civilization may already be standing on the edge of another erasure. And so the haunting question remains: when future generations sift through our ruins, will they find us remembered or forgotten? Will our skyscrapers be called myths, our achievements reattributed, our very name erased like Tartaria's? The cycle may be waiting. And if history is any guide, we may be closer to the next reset than we dare to believe. If Tartaria was once a vast empire stretching across Eurasia, with its own culture, architecture, and power, then its sudden disappearance from maps and encyclopedias poses a troubling question. What happened to its people? Empires can vanish from paper, but populations do not simply dissolve. So where did the Tartarians go? Mainstream history answers bluntly: there were no Tartarians, only scattered tribes, Mongols, Turks, Siberians, and nomads whose lands were collectively labeled Tartary by confused European cartographers. But if we take seriously the possibility of Tartaria as a genuine civilization, then this explanation falls apart. A people that once occupied the largest continuous landmass on Earth could not have simply vanished. They must have left traces in bloodlines, languages, traditions, and migration patterns. Some researchers argue that the Tartarians were absorbed into the expanding empires of the 18th and 19th centuries. Russia in particular grew rapidly during this period, swallowing Central Asia and Siberia. Local populations, once labeled Tartarians, may have been rebranded as Russians, Cossacks, or Asians under the Tsarist system. Their cities became Russian outposts, their history reclassified as peripheral rather than central. In this way, the people did not vanish, they were renamed. Others suggest the Tartarians scattered, forming diasporas that spread across Europe and even into the Americas. Evidence of this theory lies in old immigration records from the 19th century, which occasionally list arrivals in the United States or Canada as coming from Tartary. Who were these migrants, and why did their homeland disappear from official maps shortly thereafter? Were they remnants of a fading empire, forced to flee as the Great Reset closed in? Architecture offers another clue. Across cities from Moscow to Istanbul, and even as far as San Francisco, buildings display a strangely unified style. Domes, spires, arches, and immense proportions that seem out of place in their supposed timelines. Could these be the work of Tartarian hands, preserved by the descendants of its people who continued their traditions under new rulers? If so, the architecture itself may be a silent testimony to the survival of Tartarian culture, even as its name was erased. There are also whispers of Tartarian bloodlines carried into other nations. Some theorists point to the Turkic peoples, others to the Mongols, and still others to scattered Siberian tribes who retain legends of great cities buried beneath the earth. Oral traditions from these regions often speak of floods, fires, or invasions that destroyed mighty kingdoms, echoes, perhaps, of the fall of Tartaria. But perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that many Tartarians simply perished during the upheavals of the 19th century. If the mud flood theory holds any truth, then countless lives may have been lost in sudden catastrophes. Wars of expansion, plagues, and forced assimilation would have erased much of what remained. Survivors would blend into conquering populations, their identity diluted until, within a generation or two, Tartarian was a forgotten word. Where did the Tartarians go? The honest answer is that we don't know. But fragments remain. Maps, old census records, mysterious architecture, and scattered legends. These fragments hint not at extinction, but transformation. A people who may still be among us, hidden in plain sight, their name erased, but their legacy quietly enduring. If Tartaria once stretched across the steppes of Eurasia, then its people would have been woven into the vast tapestry of cultures that rose in its shadow. To understand where the Tartarians went, we must look closely at those who inherited their lands: the Russians, the Central Asians, the Mongols, and the Siberian tribes. For many researchers of the Tartaria mystery, these groups are not entirely separate from Tartaria. They may be its living descendants. The Russian Empire, in particular, absorbed enormous swathes of territory historically labeled as Tartary. As Russia expanded eastward during the 16th to 19th centuries, it encountered cities, fortresses, and sophisticated settlements that mainstream history now attributes to local tribes or to Russia's own builders. But alternative theorists suggest otherwise. These may have been remnants of Tartarian civilization. When Russia claimed these territories, it not only absorbed the land, but also the people, reclassifying them as Russians, Cossacks, or Siberians. In this way, Tartarian identity may have dissolved into the broader Russian populace, its memory erased under the umbrella of empire. But Tartarian influence may not have ended with Russia. Across Central Asia, Turkic peoples, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and Turkmen, share legends of great kingdoms that once dominated the steppes. Folk songs and oral histories sometimes describe lost cities swallowed by earth or floods, echoes of the mud flood theory. Their architecture, with its domes and geometric patterns, bears resemblance to the monumental style attributed to Tartaria. It is possible that Tartarians were gradually absorbed into these Turkic nations, their distinct identity blending into cultures that themselves became targets of empire building. The Mongols, often portrayed in mainstream history as fierce nomads who swept across Eurasia in the 13th century, may also overlap with Tartarian memory. Old maps label much of Mongolia as part of Great Tartary. Could the Mongol Empire itself have been, in part, a continuation of Tartaria under a different name? Some researchers argue that later historians deliberately exaggerated the image of Mongols as destructive nomads to conceal the possibility that they were heirs of a highly developed culture, inheriting, or even preserving, elements of Tartarian power. Further east, in Siberia, countless small tribes retain myths of ancestral homelands swallowed by disasters. The Buryats, Yakuts, and other indigenous peoples tell stories of great fires, floods, and wars that erased kingdoms before them. Some researchers connect these oral traditions to Tartaria's fall, suggesting that the memories survived in fragmented form among these remote groups. Even in Russia's own folklore, subtle traces remain. The mysterious figure of Tatars in Slavic epics often plays a shadowy role, sometimes as invaders, sometimes as allies. Were these characters distorted reflections of Tartarians, remembered dimly as history shifted? What emerges is not a story of extinction, but of assimilation and transformation. Tartaria's people may never have vanished. They became Russians, Kazakhs, Mongols, and Siberians. Their culture and bloodlines live on, hidden beneath new names and new histories. The empire was forgotten, but its people survived, scattered across Eurasia, leaving behind whispers of their existence in songs, architecture, and myths. When a civilization disappears, its memory rarely vanishes completely. It lingers in the form of myths, strange tales, and fragments of folklore. In the case of Tartaria, some of the most haunting echoes of its existence come not from maps or encyclopedias, but from the stories of giants and lost tribes, narratives passed down through generations, dismissed as legends, yet stubbornly persistent across Eurasia. Throughout Russia, Central Asia, and even Siberia, there are accounts of giant ancestors who once roamed the land. In remote villages, elders speak of colossal warriors who built monumental cities, lifted massive stones, and ruled over the steppes. These stories often describe beings not merely larger in stature, but wiser, endowed with knowledge and technologies lost to us today. Could these tales be distorted memories of Tartarians themselves, remembered by later generations as giants because their achievements were so great they seemed inhuman? Archaeological finds deepen the mystery. In Siberia and Central Asia, skeletons of unusual size have occasionally been reported, though mainstream science often dismisses them as exaggerations or misidentifications. Yet photographs from the 19th and early 20th centuries sometimes surface in archives, showing excavation teams standing beside human bones far larger than average. These are often labeled hoaxes, but they align eerily with local folklore. Alongside giants, there are tales of lost tribes. Nomadic groups across Asia tell stories of entire peoples who went underground or vanished into the mountains after a great catastrophe. Among Turkic and Mongolic tribes, legends speak of ancestral nations swallowed by floods or buried beneath mud. These stories parallel the mud flood theory of Tartaria, suggesting that survivors of such a disaster may have hidden away, retreating into remote regions, leaving behind whispers of their existence in myth. Even in Christian and Islamic traditions, the echoes remain. Some researchers connect the Gog and Magog of biblical and Quranic lore with the forgotten peoples of Tartary. Ancient maps often place Gog and Magog somewhere in the far north or east of Asia, precisely the regions labeled as Tartary. Could these terrifying nations, long feared in religious imagination, have been based on distorted memories of the Tartarians or their descendants? In European chronicles, too, the Tatars were often described with a sense of awe and dread, not simply as ordinary enemies, but as almost superhuman, larger-than-life invaders. Was this exaggeration, or did it reflect encounters with people whose scale and skill surpassed those of their adversaries? What emerges from these stories is not proof, but pattern. Across cultures, from Siberia to the Middle East, there are recurring tales of giant builders, vanished nations, and tribes swallowed by disaster. These narratives, when viewed through the lens of the Tartarian mystery, take on new significance. They may represent fragments of memory, distorted by centuries of retelling, of a people who were real, but whose name and history were erased. Perhaps the Tartarians survive even now, not in bloodlines alone, but in these haunting stories of giants and lost tribes. Their empire may be gone, but their shadow remains, a shadow cast across myth, folklore, and the silent ruins of forgotten cities. While maps and books may erase a civilization, memory often survives in the words of people, whispered stories passed from generation to generation. Across Eurasia, scattered communities have preserved oral traditions that seem to echo fragments of a forgotten past. Could these be the faint voices of Tartarian survivors? In the Siberian steppe, elders of the Yakut and Buryat peoples tell stories of a time when the land was filled with great cities, shining domes, and towers that reached the sky. Some legends speak of a sudden catastrophe, floods of mud and fire that buried these cities, leaving only ruins beneath the ground. When asked who built these wonders, the storytellers often reply with vague names: our ancestors, the Tall Ones, or the Lost Kings. These evasive descriptions suggest a deliberate forgetting, or perhaps the survival of memory too dangerous to be spoken plainly. Among Central Asian nomads, oral poetry describes battles against powerful empires that no longer exist. Epic songs speak of golden palaces and vast fortresses that once stood in the deserts, now reduced to sand. Some Kazakh traditions describe wandering tribes searching for lost homelands swallowed by earth and water. The similarity between these accounts and the mud flood theory is striking, hinting at a catastrophe that reshaped both landscape and history. In Russia, folk epics known as byliny feature shadowy characters often identified as Tatars, not always as enemies, but sometimes as rulers of mysterious cities. In some tales, these figures are described as possessing knowledge of the skies, strange machines, or powers tied to the earth itself. While modern historians dismiss such references as literary invention, they could be distorted memories of Tartarian influence, preserved in folklore long after official records were erased. Further east, among Mongolic and Turkic peoples, there are legends of hidden tribes who retreated into the mountains after a great disaster. These survivors, according to stories, still live in remote valleys, guarding secrets of the old world. Some tales claim they will return when the world enters another age of collapse, bringing with them knowledge once lost. Such myths resonate with broader ideas of cycles and resets, where civilizations fall but their remnants wait for renewal. Even in indigenous Siberian rituals, hints remain. Ceremonies honoring the spirits of the earth often include offerings to buried ancestors beneath the soil. Scholars interpret this as symbolic reverence for the dead. But others wonder, are these rituals unconscious acknowledgments of people literally buried by catastrophe, survivors who knew their civilization had been swallowed whole? What makes these oral traditions compelling is their consistency. From Siberia to Central Asia, from Russia to Mongolia, the themes repeat. Mighty cities buried, ancestors erased, survivors scattered. These are not the tales of isolated tribes, but fragments of a larger story, one that points back to civilization now absent from maps. Perhaps the survivors of Tartaria never vanished. Perhaps they kept their history alive in song, myth, and ritual. And though these stories may sound like legend today, they could be the last surviving embers of a memory that official history tried so hard to extinguish. If Tartaria truly once spanned the vast heart of Eurasia, then its people did not simply vanish into thin air. Empires may collapse, names may disappear from maps, but bloodlines endure. The haunting question is this: are there living descendants of Tartaria walking among us today? Mainstream history would argue that the Tartars were never a unified people, merely a label applied by Europeans to describe the vast lands of Central Asia. Under this view, their descendants are simply the Russians, Mongols, Kazakhs, and other peoples of the region. But for those who believe Tartaria was a genuine civilization, the search for its descendants becomes far more complex. One possibility lies in the Turkic peoples of Central Asia. The Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and Uzbeks trace their heritage to nomadic tribes of the steppe. Yet their folklore often speaks of golden ages, mighty ancestors, and cities lost beneath earth and water. These legends may be echoes of Tartarian civilization, remembered dimly through cultural memory. If so, these communities could be carrying Tartarian bloodlines, hidden in plain sight under new names. The Mongols, too, may represent an important thread. Old maps often place Great Tartary in and around Mongolia. While history emphasizes the Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan, some theorists suggest that this empire may have overlapped with, or even descended from, the Tartarians. If that is true, modern Mongolic peoples could be living reminders of an erased empire, their traditions and epics harboring fragments of a suppressed past. In Russia and Siberia, the picture is even more layered. Millions of people across these regions, from the Tatars of Kazan to the Yakuts of Siberia, may carry Tartarian ancestry. Linguistic traces remain in place: names, surnames, and dialects. The Russian state absorbed these populations during its eastward expansion, effectively dissolving them into the empire. Their identity was transformed, but their bloodlines endured, absorbed into the genetic mosaic of Russia's population. Some even point to immigrants in the West as possible Tartarian descendants. In the 18th and 19th centuries, migration records occasionally list Tartary as a place of origin. These individuals, settling in Europe or North America, may have carried fragments of Tartarian heritage abroad. Over time, their origins would blur into the immigrant experience, leaving behind only a curious entry on old documents. Perhaps the most compelling argument is not genetic, but cultural survival. Architecture, music, and oral traditions across Eurasia bear striking similarities that suggest a shared origin. Domed roofs, star-shaped fortresses, and complex folk melodies appear from Siberia to Turkey, hinting at a cultural diffusion that may be Tartarian in origin. If Tartaria's descendants walk among us, they may be identified not by blood tests, but by the persistence of these cultural fingerprints. So are there modern Tartarians? Perhaps the real answer is not yes or no, but everywhere. In Russians, Kazakhs, Mongols, Tatars, Siberian tribes, and even descendants abroad, fragments of Tartaria survive, scattered like shards of a broken mirror. Their empire was erased, their name forgotten, but their legacy continues in the faces, stories, and traditions of millions alive today. When we speak of Tartaria, we often find ourselves drawn into comparisons with another legendary civilization, Atlantis. Both represent vast, powerful societies said to have vanished in mysterious circumstances. Both linger in fragments, maps, ruins, myths, leaving behind just enough evidence to spark centuries of speculation. And both force us to ask, how many great civilizations have been lost to time, buried not just by mud and water, but by deliberate silence? Plato's account of Atlantis is famous, an advanced maritime empire, proud and powerful, destroyed in a single day and night of misfortune. Whether a myth or memory, Atlantis has become the archetype of a lost world. What is striking is how well its story parallels theories about Tartaria. Tartaria, too, is said to have been vast, sophisticated, and strangely advanced, then suddenly erased, its name vanishing from maps and encyclopedias in little more than a century. One civilization destroyed by flood, another allegedly by mud and historical manipulation. Both vanish almost overnight. Researchers who link the two argue that Tartaria may have been a continuation of the Atlantean cycle. Perhaps Atlantis was the great maritime empire of the ancient world, while Tartaria was the terrestrial empire of the more recent age. If Atlantis fell in a prehistoric cataclysm around 12,000 years ago, Tartaria could represent the rebirth of advanced civilization, only to suffer its own reset in the 19th century. The physical clues echo across continents. Atlantis is said to have left behind traces in megalithic structures like the pyramids, Stonehenge, or underwater ruins in the Caribbean. Tartaria, meanwhile, is associated with star forts, colossal cathedrals, and architecture that appears far older than the dates assigned to it. Could these be fingerprints of the same knowledge, the remnants of a tradition passed down from one lost empire to another? There are even lingering myths of giants and golden ages that connect the two. Ancient Greek tales describe Atlanteans as larger-than-life rulers, just as Central Asian folklore remembers Tartarians as giant builders. Both civilizations are often linked to mysterious technologies, Atlantis with crystal power and energy harnessed from a sea, Tartaria with domes, spires, and alleged free energy devices hidden in architecture. But perhaps the most unsettling connection lies in their erasure. Atlantis survives only as a myth told by Plato, dismissed by historians as allegory. Tartaria, in contrast, was once printed in encyclopedias and drawn on maps, only to vanish into silence. Two different methods, one goal: to strip a civilization from memory. If resets truly occur, as the hypothesis suggests, then Atlantis may have been the first draft, and Tartaria the last chapter of a story we are not supposed to read. And so the comparison endures. Atlantis is the myth of the ancient ocean. Tartaria, the mystery of the Eurasian steppe. Both may represent lost worlds in a cycle of civilizations that rise, flourish, and fall, their remains buried not just in soil and sea, but in the forgotten corridors of history. Among the myths of forgotten civilizations, few are as enigmatic as Hyperborea, the legendary northern land described by the ancient Greeks. A realm beyond the north wind, Hyperborea was said to be a place of endless daylight, inhabited by a race of people blessed with extraordinary longevity and wisdom. Though dismissed by mainstream historians as a poetic invention, Hyperborea remains one of the most persistent myths in ancient literature. And in recent years, researchers have drawn striking connections between this fabled realm and the mystery of Tartaria. Hyperborea, according to Herodotus and other Greek writers, was a paradise hidden in the far north. Its people lived in harmony, untouched by war or disease, in a land of abundant harvests and perfect climate. Some descriptions place it beyond the Ural Mountains or deep into Siberia, the very regions that later maps identified as Great Tartary. Could the Hyperboreans and Tartarians have been one and the same, remembered under different names across time? The parallels run deep. Hyperborea was often associated with giant-like beings, taller and stronger than ordinary humans, a theme that resonates with Central Asian and Siberian folklore of Tartarian giants. Ancient myths claim that Hyperboreans possessed sacred knowledge, including control over energies of the earth and sky. Likewise, Tartarian architecture, with its domes, spires, and star forts, is often theorized to have been designed for energy harnessing. Two civilizations, thousands of years apart, yet both remembered as having mysterious mastery of power. Geographically, the overlap is uncanny. Ancient maps drawn in Europe often labeled Northern Asia as the land of the Hyperboreans. Centuries later, the same regions bore the name Great Tartary. It seems each era had its term for this vast, mysterious realm beyond the frontiers of the known world. And in both cases, the civilizations described were eventually consigned to oblivion, Hyperborea to myth, Tartaria to erasure. Some esoteric traditions suggest that Hyperborea may have been the predecessor to Tartaria. In this view, Hyperborea fell to cataclysmic changes in the ancient past, perhaps the same Ice Age floods that destroyed Atlantis. Yet fragments of its people survive, rebuilding their civilization in the steppes and mountains of Eurasia, eventually becoming the Tartarians remembered in maps and encyclopedias. If true, Tartaria might not only have been real, but also the last great echo of an even older world. There are even theories that tie Hyperborea and Tartaria into cycles of resets. Hyperborea was lost to ancient catastrophe, Atlantis to flood, Tartaria to mud and manipulation. Each cycle leaves behind ruins, myths, and scattered survivors. Each cycle hints that humanity's history may be far deeper, stranger, and more fragile than we have been told. If Hyperborea was myth and Tartaria was memory, perhaps they are two faces of the same story. Civilizations beyond the reach of mainstream history, erased by disaster and silence, yet still faintly visible in the cracks of our past. As we trace the mystery of Tartaria, we inevitably encounter other legends of civilizations erased from memory. One of the most enduring is Lemuria, a supposed sunken continent said to have once existed in the Indian or Pacific Ocean. Though modern science largely dismisses Lemuria as a 19th century hypothesis to explain ancient biogeography, its persistence in esoteric traditions raises questions. Could Lemuria, like Tartaria, represent another piece of the puzzle, another civilization wiped away in a global cycle of resets? The story of Lemuria first emerged from attempts to explain why lemurs and similar species appeared in both India and Madagascar, but not in Africa or the Middle East. Some scientists proposed a lost land bridge across the Indian Ocean, a continent now sunk beneath the waves. While this theory was later replaced by plate tectonics, the name Lemuria endured, picked up by mystics and occult writers. They spoke of a vast ancient civilization, one that rivaled Atlantis, filled with spiritual knowledge, advanced technologies, and peoples who could communicate telepathically. The parallels with Tartaria are subtle but striking. Lemuria, like Tartaria, was said to span an enormous region, influencing cultures far beyond its own borders. Its people were remembered as highly advanced yet mysteriously absent from our historical records. Both civilizations are defined less by archaeological certainty than by absence and erasure. Tartaria, removed from maps, Lemuria drowned in myth. The connection grows clearer when we look at the global pattern. Nearly every continent holds myths of great civilizations lost to flood, fire, or earth. Atlantis in the Atlantic, Hyperborea in the far north, Mu in the Pacific, Lemuria in the Indian Ocean, and Tartaria across Eurasia, all share a common theme: rise, greatness, and catastrophic erasure. Could these not be separate fables, but fragments of a single repeating story, with different cultures remembering different resets? For believers, Lemuria's story fits neatly into this cycle. Where Atlantis was said to be a technological giant, Lemuria was more spiritual, a culture devoted to harmony and energy. Tartaria, centuries later, might have inherited elements of both. Monumental architecture and alleged energy systems combined with cultural and spiritual echoes preserved in oral traditions. Each reset did not destroy civilization entirely, but forced it to restart in new forms, with fragments of knowledge carried forward. Curiously, some esoteric maps of Lemuria overlap with regions that later became centers of advanced civilizations: India, Southeast Asia, and even Easter Island. Just as Tartaria's ruins may lie hidden beneath Russian and Central Asian soil, Lemuria's legacy might survive in scattered megaliths and unexplained traditions around the Indian Ocean. Mainstream archaeology denies Lemuria, calling it pseudoscience. Yet the pattern is undeniable. History is filled with unexplained gaps, and legends across the globe speak of lost worlds. If Tartaria could be erased in the 19th century, why not Lemuria in a far older reset? Seen this way, Tartaria is not an anomaly but part of a global mosaic of forgotten civilizations, each erased in its time, each leaving behind only whispers. Lemuria is one whisper, Tartaria another, both pointing to a haunting possibility, that history as we know it is only the most recent layer, built upon the ruins of worlds long forgotten. When we place Tartaria alongside Atlantis, Hyperborea, and Lemuria, something striking begins to emerge. These stories are not isolated curiosities, nor the product of a single culture's imagination. They are part of a global pattern, myths and legends scattered across continents, each describing a great civilization lost to cataclysm, each echoing the same themes of flood, fire, and deliberate forgetting. Could it be that these stories are not fantasy, but fractured memories of real resets woven into cultural myth? In the Americas, indigenous peoples preserve traditions of great floods and lost cities. The Hopi tell of repeated world ages destroyed by fire and water, with only a few survivors guided to safety. The Aztec and Mayan codices describe cycles of suns, each ending in destruction, their empires rising and falling within these cosmic resets. South American legends speak of Viracocha, a mysterious godlike figure who emerged after a great flood to rebuild humanity, much like the biblical Noah or the Sumerian Utnapishtim. Across Africa, myths of ancient kingdoms resonate with the Tartarian enigma. Ethiopian traditions tell of Prester John, a hidden emperor ruling a lost Christian kingdom, rich in wisdom and power, erased from maps just as Tartaria was centuries later. Meanwhile, the Dogon of Mali preserve knowledge of star systems invisible to the naked eye, wisdom they attribute to beings from an earlier, more advanced age. In Asia, the parallels grow sharper. Indian mythology speaks of great yugas, vast cycles of civilizations destroyed by cosmic upheavals. Texts like the Mahabharata describe weapons of unimaginable power, cities reduced to ash and blasts that sound eerily like modern warfare. Could these be memories of resets so ancient that they were preserved only as myth? And in Central Asia, folk tales describe once mighty kingdoms swallowed by the earth, imagery that resonates directly with mud flood theories surrounding Tartaria. The European tradition is no different. From Plato's Atlantis to Norse tales of Ragnarok, myths consistently describe civilizations undone by disaster, their knowledge scattered, their memory fading into legend. Hyperborea, the Greek paradise of the far north, seems to prefigure Tartaria itself, a vast realm beyond the frontiers of the known world, blessed with knowledge, yet ultimately erased. Even Oceania contributes to this chorus of memory. The Polynesians speak of Hawaii, a lost homeland swallowed by the sea, while Easter Island's Moai statues stand as silent guardians of a forgotten past. Could these be remnants of Lemuria or Mu, civilizations remembered in fragments by island cultures spread across the Pacific? When we compare these myths across continents, the similarities are too consistent to dismiss. Civilizations that rise to great heights, wiped out by catastrophe, leaving behind survivors who carry fragments of knowledge into the next age. Whether in the deserts of Africa, the jungles of the Americas, the steppes of Eurasia, or the islands of the Pacific, the story repeats. Perhaps Tartaria is simply one chapter in this global epic, the last remembered empire erased not in prehistory, but in modern times. If myths across the world align in their message, then the mystery of Tartaria is not an anomaly, but confirmation of a pattern that has shaped humanity again and again. When we piece together the scattered fragments of myth, legend, and suppressed history, we begin to see not isolated mysteries, but a chain of forgotten civilizations, links in a sequence that stretches across millennia. Tartaria, Atlantis, Hyperborea, Lemuria, Mu, each is said to have risen in power, flourished with knowledge, and then fallen into silence. Though mainstream history insists these are myths or misunderstandings, their recurring patterns hint at something deeper. Humanity's story may not be linear, but cyclical, with each age building upon the ashes of the last. The chain begins in prehistory with Atlantis, remembered as the archetypal lost civilization. Described by Plato as a maritime empire destroyed by floods, is said to have left echoes in Egypt, Mesoamerica, and megalithic ruins across the globe. Its destruction may have been the first reset, pushing survivors to spread fragments of knowledge to emerging cultures. From there, we move to Hyperborea, the land of endless daylight. While Atlantis belonged to the sea, Hyperborea was of the north, a vast territory said to be populated by wise giants tied to the cycles of the Earth's energies. Its echoes survive in Greek myths, Norse sagas, and Siberian folklore. Hyperborea may have been another link in the chain, a northern empire erased by shifting climates or cataclysm. The next link is Lemuria, often associated with the Indian or Pacific Ocean. Unlike Atlantis' technological grandeur or Hyperborea's mysticism, Lemuria is remembered as a spiritual civilization, one that may have emphasized harmony with nature. Legends from India, Southeast Asia, and Polynesia point to lands lost beneath rising seas. Here, too, the chain continues, a people erased, their wisdom scattered across the world. Then there is Mu, the great Pacific continent, described by 19th century explorers and occultists. Said to have stretched across the ocean, its fall allegedly left survivors on islands like Easter Island and in cultures across Oceania. Massive stone structures in remote places may be the fingerprints of this vanished civilization, yet another link lost to time. Finally, we arrive at Tartaria, a civilization not drowned in prehistoric floods, but seemingly erased in recent centuries. Unlike the ancient myths, Tartaria existed in maps, encyclopedias, and even photographs. Is the link closest to us, perhaps the most dangerous, because its erasure was not accomplished by nature, but by human hands. While Atlantis and Lemuria can be dismissed as ancient stories, Tartaria's disappearance happened under the watch of modern empires, when printing presses and record-keeping should have preserved its memory. Taken together, these civilizations form a haunting pattern: rise, greatness, collapse, erasure. The names change, the settings shift, but the chain remains. Each civilization, whether real or mythologized, seems to play the same role, a brilliant link in humanity's forgotten past, deliberately or catastrophically severed before the next age begins. If Tartaria is indeed part of this chain, then its mystery is not just about one lost empire. It is about the continuity of forgotten worlds, the fragments left behind, and the chilling possibility that our own civilization may simply be the next link, destined to shine, collapse, and be forgotten in turn. When people first encounter the mystery of Tartaria, one of the most tantalizing questions arises not from its maps or raced encyclopedias, but from its architecture. The domes, spires, star forts, and intricate towers scattered across Eurasia and beyond seem to defy not only historical explanation, but practical purpose. Were they mere stylistic choices? Or could they have been part of something far more radical, a system of free energy that once powered the forgotten empire of Tartaria? Free energy theories surrounding Tartaria are rooted in the observation that many of its structures resemble machines as much as monuments. Cathedrals crowned with enormous domes, towers capped with metallic spires, and strange antenna-like features all hint at an understanding of electricity or atmospheric energy long before the age of modern technology. To believers, these were not simply religious buildings but power stations designed to harness the Earth's natural currents and the energy of the ether. The idea is not entirely unfounded in context. In the 19th century, inventors like Nikola Tesla demonstrated that wireless transmission of power was not only possible but practical. Tesla envisioned a world where free electricity could be drawn from the atmosphere itself, distributed without wires, and available to all. Yet his projects were suppressed, his Wardenclyffe Tower dismantled, and his legacy partially buried. Could it be that Tartaria had achieved what Tesla attempted, and that their entire civilization was silenced for the same reasons? Supporters of this theory point to the peculiar uniformity of Tartarian-style architecture across continents. From Moscow to St. Petersburg, from parts of Central Asia to even unexpected sites in North America, the same grandiose designs appear. Many of these buildings include domes plated with conductive metals, tall spires aligned with geomagnetic fields, and even evidence of acoustics that seem engineered for vibration and resonance. Were these the remnants of an ancient, decentralized power grid? Adding to the mystery are reports of world fairs in the 19th century, where enormous temporary buildings were erected with dazzling lights and massive electrical displays, yet supposedly dismantled afterward. Some argue these fairs were not exhibitions of progress, but cover stories, opportunities to rebrand surviving Tartarian technology as modern inventions while quietly dismantling the evidence of the old world. If Tartaria had indeed discovered how to harness free energy, it would explain not only their advanced architecture but also their erasure. A world powered freely by nature would eliminate the control systems of empires built on coal, oil, and industry. To allow such knowledge to survive would have meant the collapse of the very powers that replaced Tartaria. In this sense, Tartaria's destruction may not have been accidental but deliberate, a reset designed to bury forbidden technology. Yet the ruins remain. Cathedrals with inexplicable acoustics, towers that seem like tuning forks, star forts shaped like resonant energy fields. Whether symbolic or functional, they whisper of a time when power flowed not through wires and fuel, but through the very air and stone. A time when Tartaria may have mastered the secret of free energy and was erased because of it. When we walk through old cities and gaze upon their towering cathedrals, domes, and palaces, we are often told these are mere symbols of faith or monuments of power. But what if they were something more? What if architecture itself was technology, designed not only to impress, but to harness and manipulate forces of nature? Within the mystery of Tartaria, this is one of the most provocative claims, that their buildings were machines in stone, remnants of a civilization that understood the secrets of energy long before our industrial age. Consider the domes and spires that crown so many Tartarian-style buildings. From Moscow's onion-shaped cathedrals to the Capitol domes in the United States, their shapes are not arbitrary. Domes amplify resonance, capturing sound and energy waves, while spires act as conductors, pointing skyward like antennae. Some researchers argue these structures once formed part of a network that could draw and distribute atmospheric electricity, the very vision Tesla tried to recreate with his Wardenclyffe Tower centuries later. Then there are the star forts, geometric citadels whose sprawling, fractal-like designs are visible from the air. While historians call them military defenses, their intricate, repeating angles look less like cannon walls and more like energy fields. Some theorists suggest these star patterns could manipulate electromagnetic forces, channeling power through the ground in ways we no longer understand. If so, Tartaria's cities were not just habitable spaces, they were engineered grids of energy flow. The interiors of these buildings add to the mystery. Enormous halls with perfect acoustics, marble floors that resonate when walked upon, stained glass that diffuses sunlight into prismatic colors. All of these features feel designed for more than beauty. They suggest an understanding of vibration, frequency, and light as functional forces. Imagine a cathedral where voices in harmony did more than echo. They activated the structure itself, amplifying energy in ways our modern science is only beginning to explore. Another striking detail lies in materials. Copper domes, iron frameworks, and stone foundations aligned with geomagnetic fields, choices that hint at conductivity and energy storage. Were these not decorative, but deliberate elements of a forgotten technology? If Tartaria mastered this science, their architecture may have been less about symbolism and more about utility, power plants disguised as monuments. World fairs deepen the mystery. In the 19th century, dazzling, temporary buildings appeared across Europe and America, many displaying these same features: domes, spires, and impossible construction on a scale that boggles the mind. Visitors marveled at electrical illuminations that supposedly ran on primitive systems, yet rivaled modern displays. Soon after, these structures were demolished, erased as if to hide a secret. Were they remnants of Tartarian technology, presented as new, but actually inherited from a lost empire? If architecture truly was technology, then Tartaria's disappearance becomes easier to understand. A civilization capable of drawing free energy from the environment would threaten the economic foundations of modern industry. To control history, it was not enough to erase Tartaria from maps. Its buildings had to be rebranded as religious or cultural relics, stripped of their true purpose. The stone and metal still stand, silent witnesses to a knowledge we no longer recognize. Perhaps one day we will look at a cathedral, a fort, or a dome and see not a monument, but a machine, a relic of Tartaria's forbidden technology. One of the most astonishing claims tied to Tartaria is that the empire may have possessed technologies that rival, or even surpass, those of our modern age. Among these, the most striking are reports and images of airships, mysterious flying craft depicted in 19th century photographs, engravings, and eyewitness accounts. If true, this would rewrite not only Tartaria's legacy, but the entire narrative of human technological progress. Throughout the 1800s, newspapers in the United States and Europe reported sightings of mysterious airships, giant vessels floating across the skies, often cigar-shaped or resembling massive balloons with metallic frameworks. Witnesses described them as moving silently, sometimes powered by whirring mechanisms or glowing with strange lights. The mainstream explanation has long been that these were hoaxes or misidentified prototypes. Yet some researchers argue these were not experiments at all, but survivors of Tartarian technology that briefly appeared before being erased from history. The design of many Tartarian buildings seems to hint at this possibility. Grand spires, domes, and metallic elements might not have been only about energy collection. They may have also functioned as docking points or power stations for such aerial vehicles. Some even suggest that the ornate towers of cathedrals or civic buildings were once used to recharge or tether airships, drawing energy from the atmosphere itself. The idea becomes more intriguing when we look at the world fairs of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Visitors reported marvels of technology: electric lamps, moving walkways, and even rudimentary flying machines. But many of these technologies seem to appear out of nowhere, with no gradual development, no prototypes in archives. Could these wonders have been relics of Tartarian engineering, displayed under the guise of progress before being hidden away or claimed as modern inventions? Stranger still are accounts of orphan machines, massive pipe organs that produce vibrations powerful enough to affect matter, strange towers with no clear function, or gigantic bells and mechanisms embedded within cathedrals that seem more like industrial devices than instruments of faith. In Tartarian lore, these are seen not as curiosities, but as surviving pieces of a technological system that once linked sound, energy, and motion. Airships fit neatly into this narrative. If Tartaria had mastered wireless energy, then flight would not have required combustion engines as we know them. Instead, airships might have been powered by natural energy fields, silent, clean, and efficient. The sudden rise of industrial fuel-based aviation in the 20th century may have been less about innovation and more about replacement, ensuring that humanity would never return to the forgotten secrets of free flight. Skeptics argue that no physical evidence of Tartarian airships survives. But photographs of unexplained crafts, combined with reports of phantom airships in both Europe and America, remain a stubborn mystery. Were these the last echoes of a dying technology, glimpses of machines from civilization that was being deliberately erased? If so, Tartaria's strange inventions, from resonant machines to airships, remind us that technology does not only move forward. Sometimes it moves in cycles, discovered, lost, suppressed, and forgotten. And perhaps, high above the ruins of forgotten cathedrals, once drifted the silent ships of a world we were never meant to remember. Whenever history leaves us with unanswered questions, one place we might expect to find clarity is in archives, the libraries, patent offices, and collections that should preserve the legacy of human knowledge. And yet, when we dig into the story of Tartaria, we find something chilling: a silence. Documents missing, patents forgotten, inventions attributed to others, and whole sections of our technological story redacted. Could this be accidental loss or deliberate suppression? In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the world saw an explosion of patents. Steam engines, telegraphs, light bulbs, and airplanes were supposedly appearing from inventors' workshops almost overnight. But researchers of Tartaria point out a strange anomaly. Many of these inventions appear in the record without prototypes, without gradual evolution, and with suspiciously little documentation leading up to them. They seem to burst into existence fully formed, as if humanity had suddenly rediscovered technologies that were already known, then hidden away. One example often cited is Nikola Tesla's work. Tesla's patents on wireless power, resonance, and atmospheric energy were filed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but many of his notes and designs mysteriously vanished after his death. His famous Wardenclyffe Tower was dismantled under pressure, and his vision of free energy was buried. Some theorists argue Tesla wasn't inventing in isolation, but rediscovering knowledge that once powered Tartaria, knowledge that governments and industrial powers swiftly suppressed to preserve control over energy and economy. But Tesla is not alone. Early patents on alternative energy, sound resonance, and wireless transmission exist, but are often stamped as classified or quietly lost in obscurity. Old archives from the 1800s, encyclopedias, scientific journals, and World's Fair reports reference technologies that were supposedly experimental but vanished from the records soon after. It's as if they were intentionally erased, hidden in vaults where only a select few could access them. Then there are the architectural blueprints. Many Tartarian-style buildings were demolished in the 19th and 20th centuries, but those that remain often have missing or incomplete construction records. How were massive domes and star forts built with supposed 18th century tools? Where are the patents for the machines that could have cut, transported, and placed blocks of stone, weighing tons with precision? The silence in the archives raises a disturbing question. Were these records destroyed to hide evidence of technologies beyond our accepted timeline? The theory grows darker when tied to the idea of the Great Reset. If entire civilizations can be erased, their maps replaced, their architecture rebranded, then surely their technological legacy could be locked away as well. Patents filed but suppressed. Archives rewritten. The knowledge of Tartaria's machines, its airships, and its free energy devices quietly absorbed by emerging industrial powers. Hidden archives and lost patents may not simply be missing pages in history. They may be the keys to a world once powered by a different science. A world where energy was free, structures were machines, and technology was so integrated into daily life that we no longer recognize it in the ruins around us. And if that knowledge exists buried in vaults or misfiled under forgotten codes, then perhaps Tartaria's technology is not truly lost, only waiting to be rediscovered. At the heart of the Tartarian mystery lies a single, chilling question. Why would anyone want to erase an entire civilization? Its people, its architecture, and especially its technology. Theories abound, but most converge on one powerful idea. Knowledge itself is power. And if Tartaria had unlocked secrets that could reshape society, then hiding that knowledge would be essential for those who seek control. One reason often suggested is energy. If Tartaria had truly mastered free energy, pulling power from the ether, the earth, or atmospheric electricity, it would have eliminated the need for coal, oil, and gas. Such technology, freely available to all, would have dismantled the foundations of industrial empires. There would be no monopolies, no profits from fossil fuels, and no central control over how people access the lifeblood of modern society, energy. In this sense, erasing Tartaria wasn't just historical revision. It was economic warfare, ensuring the new industrial order had no rival. Another possibility is social control. A civilization built on free-flowing energy, advanced resonance, and architecture as technology would not require the rigid hierarchies that define modern nation-states. If people could live in abundance without dependence on centralized power, governments, corporations, and elites would lose their grip. Erasing Tartaria meant erasing the memory of a world where life did not revolve around scarcity, taxation, or obedience to authority. Then there is ideological control. History is the story we are told about ourselves. By shaping that story, those in power shape identity and possibility. If Tartaria existed, thriving, vast, advanced, then our narrative of progress collapses. We are not the pinnacle of human achievement, but the survivors of a cycle, living in the shadow of a lost golden age. Acknowledging Tartaria would mean admitting that history is not linear, and that civilizations far older or stranger than ours may have achieved wonders we cannot yet replicate. To admit this would unravel the very idea of modern superiority. The suppression may also serve a psychological purpose. If people knew civilizations could rise and fall in cycles, with entire resets wiping out knowledge in a single generation, they might begin to question their own security. The illusion of stability, of inevitable progress, depends on keeping the past fragmented and safe. By erasing Tartaria, the story of humanity remains a steady march from primitive to advanced, a comforting lie. Finally, there is the question of inheritance. If Tartarian technologies still exist, hidden in vaults or archives, then someone may already be using them. The world's elite may not have destroyed Tartarian knowledge at all. They may have simply hoarded it. Hidden patents, secret archives, and strange technologies that surface in times of war suggest that this knowledge didn't vanish, but was seized and rebranded. What we see as modern breakthroughs may, in fact, be fragments of Tartaria trickling back into use under controlled hands. In the end, the answer to why Tartaria's knowledge would be hidden is the same answer that echoes throughout history. To control the future, one must control the past. If Tartaria's true legacy were revealed, it could free humanity from the systems that bind it today. And for those who benefit from those systems, that is the greatest danger of all. Amidst the fog of erased maps, vanished encyclopedias, and suppressed patents, there are still fragments of Tartaria that no one can fully deny. They rise from the ground like whispers of a forgotten empire, their designs etched into the earth itself. Among the most striking of these remnants are the star forts, colossal geometric citadels that deck the world from Europe to Asia to the Americas. These star-shaped fortresses, with their repeating fractal patterns and sprawling layouts, remain one of the strongest pieces of evidence that Tartaria may not be just myth or conspiracy, but a chapter of history deliberately rewritten. At first glance, star forts are explained as military constructions. Historians tell us they were designed in the Renaissance and Baroque periods to defend against cannon fire, their angles dispersing the force of artillery. But when you look closer, this explanation begins to crack. The sheer scale and precision of these structures, many built at a time when technology was supposedly primitive, defies simple logic. Some span miles with perfectly symmetrical points, intricate bastions, and moats aligned as if traced by a giant compass. Could such vast and complex designs really have been built with the tools available centuries ago? Even stranger is the global spread of these forts. Star-shaped citadels can be found in Italy, France, and Spain, yes, but also in India, Russia, North Africa, and North America. How could the exact same designs appear across continents, often long before those regions were supposedly interconnected? Traditional history claims colonization spread the design, but the pattern suggests something far deeper, perhaps a shared blueprint inherited from a forgotten empire. For Tartarian researchers, the star forts were not merely defensive works, but energetic devices. Their repeating angles, fractal-like geometry, and placement along rivers and coastlines hint at a purpose beyond warfare. Some theorists argue that the forts functioned as massive energy systems, channeling water, sound, and electromagnetic currents. The moats and waterways around them were not just for defense, but part of a hydraulic network, while the symmetrical star patterns may have amplified Earth energies, much like a tuning fork resonates with sound. Take the example of the Fort Bortange in the Netherlands or the Palmanova Fortress in Italy. Seen from above, they resemble mandalas or sacred geometry rather than simple military installations. The same is true of forts in India, such as those at Rajasthan, or in North America, like the fortresses of Quebec. Their striking similarity suggests a unifying principle, a design language that transcended borders, cultures, and centuries. Mainstream history dismisses this as coincidence or imitation. Yet the star forts remain stubbornly physical, their lines too precise, their forms too universal to ignore. If they were truly just defenses, why were they built on such monumental scales, in such impossible locations, and with such uncanny beauty? Perhaps these forts are survivors of Tartaria's knowledge, the bones of a forgotten technology rebranded as mere military relics. Unlike erased maps or missing archives, they cannot be hidden in vaults or libraries. They sit in plain sight, silent and enduring, daring us to look deeper. And when we do, we might realize that the world still carries the fingerprints of Tartaria, carved into the very ground beneath our feet. If Tartaria was erased from the modern story of history, then maps, the cartographer's fingerprints of the past, may hold the most damning proof of all. Hidden in old libraries, archives, and private collections, countless maps from the 16th through the 18th centuries boldly display the name Tartaria stretched across the vast northern expanse of Asia. These maps, drawn by respected geographers, explorers, and royal cartographers, were not fringe curiosities. They were mainstream representations of the world as it was known in their time. Open an atlas from the 1600s, and you will not find Russia spanning Siberia, nor China dominating Central Asia. Instead, you will see Great Tartary, a sprawling empire stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from the Arctic tundra to the Himalayas. Subdivisions such as independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and Muscovite Tartary are clearly marked, suggesting not a vague myth, but an accepted geopolitical reality. How then did this vast empire vanish from later editions, leaving barely a whisper in modern history books? Some of the most striking examples include the works of Gerard dus Mercator, the famed Flemish cartographer, whose world maps in the late 1500s shaped Europe's understanding of the globe. His maps detail Tartaria as a massive territory, distinct from both Russia and China, populated by diverse tribes and cities. Later cartographers, such as Guillaume de Lisle and Johann Baptist Homan, continued the tradition into the 1700s. Their works, many of which are still preserved in European libraries, consistently recognize Tartaria as a legitimate empire. The persistence of the name raises disturbing questions. If Tartaria was simply a vague label for unknown lands, why was it detailed with such subdivisions and borders? If it was merely a cartographic placeholder, why did it vanish so suddenly in the 19th century, replaced by the expansion of Russian and Chinese territories? It is almost as if Tartaria was written out of existence, its borders erased and absorbed, its people rebranded. Some Tartarian researchers argue that this was no accident, but part of a systematic effort to rewrite geography. By erasing Tartaria from maps, future generations would no longer question its existence. They would see only Russia and China, where once a vast empire stood. Over time, the memory of Tartaria would fade, confined to obscure references buried in archives. Even today, if you dig through antique collections or explore the digital archives of old libraries, the name leaps off the page like a ghost: Tartaria. Its letters stretch across the maps of Europe, Asia, and beyond, impossible to ignore. These maps are not speculation. They are tangible artifacts, evidence that cannot be brushed away with claims of myth or imagination. Perhaps this is why so few people know of them. For mainstream history, acknowledging Tartaria on these maps would raise too many questions about what was lost and why. The maps endure in dusty volumes and forgotten archives, silent witnesses to a world that once was a world deliberately erased, but not completely forgotten. When historians dismiss Tartaria as myth, believers often point to something that cannot be easily ignored: photographs. Unlike maps or texts, which can be debated as outdated terms or poetic exaggerations, photographs stand as stark witnesses to what once was. And scattered through archives, newspapers, and private collections are haunting images of buildings that seem far too grand, too advanced, and too strange for the eras they were supposedly built in. These photographs reveal structures towering above cities with domes the size of cathedrals, spires that reach into the sky like antennas, and facades decorated with stonework so intricate it rivals or surpasses modern construction. Yet curiously, many of these buildings are either gone today or heavily modified, stripped of their original majesty. They appear in old black and white frames, sometimes with horse-drawn carriages in the foreground, other times during the early days of photography, when glass plates captured their impossible scale. Perhaps the most compelling examples come from the world fairs of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Photographs from Chicago's 1893 World's Columbian Exposition or the Paris Expositions of 1889 and 1900 show entire cities of domed palaces, star-towered halls, and monumental arches. Officially, these structures were said to be temporary, made of plaster, wood, and steel frames, only to be dismantled after the events. But the photographs tell another story: buildings that look permanent, solid, and built with the skill of master stonemasons. Why would so much effort be put into temporary monuments, only to tear them down after a few months? Was this a convenient cover for displaying, and then destroying, surviving Tartarian architecture? Other photographs found in city archives show inexplicable ruins in places where such structures should not exist. Massive stone blocks half buried in mud, archways sticking out of the ground at odd angles, and entire lower floors of buildings sunken beneath street level. These eerie images align perfectly with the mud flood theory, suggesting that many Tartarian buildings were not destroyed by time alone, but literally buried in a cataclysm. Then there are the curious details: empty streets. Many photographs from the late 1800s and early 1900s show sprawling cities filled with colossal architecture, yet devoid of people, as if entire urban centers were built and abandoned overnight. The official explanation is that long exposure times blurred out moving figures. But in some images, the stillness is uncanny, raising questions about whether these were cities freshly reset, waiting to be repopulated by a new narrative of history. Modern investigators have begun collecting these photographs, compiling them as a mosaic of forgotten evidence. From St. Petersburg's impossible palaces to San Francisco's pre-1906 earthquake structures, from Indian star forts to European cathedrals with unknown construction dates, the visual record suggests a global architectural language, one that official history cannot fully explain. While historians insist these images depict nothing more than ornate 18th or 19th century architecture, Tartarian researchers see them as photographic proof of a civilization erased. The stone, the domes, the towers, they remain frozen in time, whispering of a past too advanced, too disruptive to be allowed into our official story. If Tartaria truly existed, then its heartland should still carry scars and fragments of its presence. And when we turn our eyes to the vast wilderness of Siberia and Central Asia, we find ruins and anomalies that defy easy explanation. Colossal stone blocks, shattered walls, and megalithic remains buried deep in landscapes where no such structures should exist. These ruins, rarely discussed in mainstream archaeology, whisper of a forgotten civilization whose footprints still mark the frozen earth. One of the most mysterious sites lies in the Siberian wilderness, near the Ural and Sayan mountains. Massive stone walls, some blocks weighing hundreds of tons, sit scattered across remote regions with no known builders. Local legends speak of giants who once roamed these lands, being strong enough to raise stones larger than modern cranes can lift. Archaeologists sometimes dismiss them as natural formations, yet the cut edges, right angles, and stacked patterns suggest deliberate construction. If Tartaria had truly spanned Siberia, could these be remnants of its strongholds or fortresses? In southern Siberia, near Gornaya Shoria, there exists what some call the world's largest megaliths. These blocks, stacked like a cyclopean wall, measure dozens of feet across, each weighing thousands of tons. Their weathered surfaces blend into mountain, leading skeptics to argue they are geological accidents. But up close, many show telltale signs of precision cutting. How could such structures exist in an area with no recorded civilization capable of building them? Further east, in the Altai Mountains, myths intertwine with ruins. Local shamanic traditions speak of an ancient kingdom destroyed by floods and fire, a tale that mirrors both Tartarian theories and global flood myths. Scattered ruins, burial mounds, and strange carvings point to an advanced culture that vanished without explanation. Some researchers believe the Altai may have been a cradle of Tartaria, its strongholds lost to both natural cataclysm and deliberate erasure. Across Central Asia, ruins often attributed to unknown tribes raise further questions. The Arkham settlement, sometimes called Russia's Stonehenge, shows advanced astronomical alignments and circular urban planning dating back thousands of years. Officially, it predates Tartaria by millennia, but for alternative historians, it may represent an ancestral root of the same civilization, proof of an enduring presence in the steppes long before modern borders were drawn. What unites these sites is their impossible scale and mysterious abandonment. Why would cultures supposedly primitive in tools and numbers construct fortresses of stone that rival modern feats of engineering? And why, in many cases, are these ruins left unstudied, brushed aside as natural anomalies or prehistoric oddities? The silence around them echoes the larger silence of Tartaria itself. For those who investigate the hidden past, the ruins of Siberia and Asia are not mere curiosities. They are anchors of evidence, physical reminders that the official story may not account for all that once was. Whether built by Tartaria or by civilizations that preceded it, they stand as stone testimonies, stubbornly refusing to fit into the neat timeline of history. The frozen winds of Siberia may cover them in snow, but the ruins remain. And in their silence, they seem to ask, what world was lost here, and why does no one speak its name? Archaeology is supposed to be the science of uncovering truth from the soil, the study of ruins, bones, and artifacts that reveal who we are and where we came from. Yet when it comes to Tartaria, a disturbing silence persists. The ruins are there. The maps exist. The photographs remain. And yet, mainstream archaeology avoids the subject as if the very word were dangerous. Why? Because to acknowledge Tartaria would mean rewriting the timeline of civilization itself. Across Siberia, Central Asia, and beyond, excavations often uncover anomalies, buried buildings with windows below ground level, massive stone blocks cut with impossible precision, or artifacts that appear out of place for their supposed age. Instead of confronting these mysteries, official reports frequently label them as natural formations, misinterpretations, or the remnants of unrelated cultures. But what if these are the bones of Tartaria, lying in plain sight, waiting for acknowledgement? Take the mud flood evidence. Entire cities in Europe, Asia, and America reveal buildings with lower levels sunken beneath current street level. Archaeologists often explain this as centuries of construction and erosion. But photographs from the 19th century show that these sunken levels existed not after centuries, but immediately after certain cataclysmic events. Why is this anomaly not studied with more rigor? Why is the possibility of a global event that buried cities dismissed before it is even examined? Or consider the megalithic ruins of Siberia and Central Asia. Archaeology acknowledges their existence, but struggles to explain them. Official narratives assign them to local tribes with primitive tools, yet the size and scale of these constructions rival the pyramids. To admit they might belong to Tartaria, or to a highly advanced culture not recognized by history, would shatter the accepted model of human progress. Thus, silence becomes safer than truth. There are also artifacts found in unexpected places, metal objects embedded in coal seams, intricate carvings on stones thousands of miles apart, or giant skeletons quietly whisked away from excavation sites. Each time, such discoveries make headlines, then vanish into obscurity. Could they be fragments of Tartaria, quickly buried not by earth, but by academic denial? The reluctance of archaeology is not merely intellectual, it is also political. Funding for excavations, academic reputations, and the stability of historical narratives all depend on conformity. Acknowledging Tartaria would not just alter history textbooks, it would demand a complete reevaluation of how civilizations rise and fall. Worse, it might expose that our history has been deliberately controlled, not simply misinterpreted. For those who investigate outside the mainstream, this silence speaks volumes. Archaeology dares not say what the evidence suggests, that Tartaria may have been real, vast, and technologically advanced, that its ruins lie beneath our cities, its artifacts hidden in vaults, its story erased from official records. And so, the ruins stand unspoken, the artifacts gather dust, and the photographs remain unexplained. Archaeology pretends not to see, but the evidence whispers on. In the end, it may not be scholars who reveal Tartaria, but ordinary people willing to ask, what truth lies buried beneath the silence? If Tartaria truly existed, a vast empire marked on maps, described in encyclopedias, and visible in strange architecture, then its erasure had to be systematic. It was not enough to remove names from charts or demolish suspicious buildings. The most effective tool for erasure has always been education. What is taught in schools becomes truth, and what is omitted becomes myth. By rewriting history books in the 19th and 20th centuries, the memory of Tartaria was quietly replaced with a narrative of rising nation-states, industrial progress, and linear human development. Look at the school curriculum. Students around the world learn of Rome, Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia as the cradles of civilization. They learn of China's dynasties and Europe's Renaissance. But nowhere do they hear of Tartaria. The word does not appear in their textbooks, not even as a footnote. Yet if you open encyclopedias from the 18th century, Tartaria is there, vast and undeniable. How can something once so widely acknowledged vanish so completely from a classroom? The answer lies in the deliberate rewriting of history. During the 19th century, as European empires expanded and Russia consolidated its power over Siberia, maps were revised. Tartaria was absorbed into the territories of Russia, China, and other nations. Textbooks soon followed suit. Where once children might have seen Great Tartary stretching across Asia, they were now told it had always been Russia or Mongolia. Future generations would never question what they were taught. The empire that had once filled half the globe was reduced to a phantom, erased not by force of arms alone, but by the stroke of a pen. This rewriting served a deeper purpose, to reinforce the myth of linear progress. Schools taught that humanity moved steadily from primitive caves to agriculture, then to cities, then to industry. Acknowledging Tartaria, with its advanced architecture, strange technologies, and vast reach, would shatter this illusion. It would suggest that history is not linear but cyclical, with civilizations rising and falling in resets. Such an idea would undermine the authority of modern powers, which rely on the belief that they represent the pinnacle of human achievement. The printing press and public education systems became the perfect tools for this cover-up. With mass literacy spreading in the 19th and 20th centuries, centralized governments and institutions could standardize the story everyone was told. History became a carefully curated narrative. And Tartaria, it was left behind in dusty atlases and forgotten encyclopedias, inaccessible to ordinary students and never mentioned by their teachers. Today, when people stumble upon the word Tartary in old documents or maps, it feels alien, a name from another dimension. But this alienation is by design. The education system has trained us to view anything outside the official timeline as either myth, conspiracy, or error. To ask about Tartaria is to step outside the boundaries of acceptable knowledge. In truth, the greatest erasure did not happen on battlefields or in burning libraries. It happened in classrooms. The cover-up of Tartaria succeeded not because people destroyed all evidence, but because generations were simply never told to look. When we ask why Tartaria disappeared, we must look at who had the power to make it vanish. Maps, encyclopedias, and architecture cannot erase themselves. Behind the curtain stood empires, rising superpowers of the 18th and 19th centuries, who had the means, motive, and authority to reshape the past to suit their future. At the heart of this process was the Russian Empire. By the early 18th century, under Peter the Great and later Catherine the Great, Russia sought to expand and legitimize its dominion across Siberia and Central Asia, territories once marked as Tartary. Absorbing these vast lands into Russia meant more than military conquest. It required rewriting history so that the world no longer remembered a great empire of Tartars. The maps were redrawn, the chronicles edited, and the idea of Tartaria faded into the background of barbarian tribes. The British Empire also played its role. With colonial ambitions stretching from India to China, Britain sought to dominate trade routes once associated with Tartaria's influence. By controlling narratives in academic circles, British historians painted a picture of Asia divided between civilized and savage lands, never acknowledging that a sophisticated empire may have once ruled over vast regions. To admit Tartaria's existence would have weakened Britain's narrative of bringing progress to supposedly primitive territories. The French Empire contributed through intellectual dominance. Paris was a hub of Enlightenment scholarship, producing encyclopedias and histories that influenced Europe's view of the past. In the 18th century, these works still described Tartary as a recognized entity. But by the 19th century, as France sought to emphasize its own cultural superiority, Tartaria was rebranded as a vague wilderness, its people reduced to nomads. This shift aligned neatly with French colonial rhetoric, the civilized versus the uncivilized. In China, the Qing dynasty also had a hand in rewriting the record. By consolidating its control over Inner Asia, the Qing administration systematically absorbed territories once identified with Tartary into its imperial structure. This reinforced the notion that Tartaria never truly existed as an empire, only as a geographical shorthand for lands China now claimed. Together, these empires built a unified front of silence. Whether through maps, schools, or political narratives, they buried Tartaria beneath layers of nation-state identity. The idea of a once mighty power that spanned continents became dangerous, for it suggested that no empire was eternal, that civilizations could rise, flourish, and fall outside the neat boundaries drawn by rulers. Who benefits from this rewriting? The answer is clear: the empires themselves. By erasing Tartaria, they solidified their authority, legitimized their conquests, and reshaped the memory of the people they governed. History became not the story of humanity, but the story of victors. And so, Tartaria became a ghost empire, hidden not because it left no trace, but because those in power demanded it be forgotten. If history is written by the victors, then academia is the institution that stamps that history with the seal of truth. Universities, research institutes, and professional historians act as the gatekeepers of what we are allowed to consider knowledge. And when it comes to Tartaria, those gates have been firmly locked. The word itself is taboo. Search through modern academic journals and history textbooks, and you will rarely, if ever, find the name Tartaria mentioned except as a dismissive footnote. If a subject appears at all, it is reduced to a vague geographical label, a word mapmakers once used for unknown lands. No serious inquiry is permitted into whether Tartaria could have been a functioning empire, let alone a highly advanced one. This silence is not an accident, it is a choice. How did this come to be? During the 19th century, as empires solidified their control, universities were increasingly tied to state interests. Professors who contradicted official narratives risked losing their positions, their funding, or their credibility. Academic institutions began to reward conformity, repeating the accepted timeline of history: Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, medieval Europe, Renaissance, Enlightenment, and Industrial Revolution. Anything outside this linear progression was either ignored or ridiculed. Tartaria simply did not fit the script. Even today, archaeology departments avoid anomalies that might point to a suppressed civilization. When megalithic ruins in Siberia, Asia, or Eastern Europe raise questions about advanced ancient builders, these mysteries are brushed aside as natural formations or misinterpretations. When mud flood evidence appears in old cities, buildings with lower floors buried beneath the earth, academics explain it away with routine urban development. To suggest otherwise would invite professional ruin. This silence creates a feedback loop. Scholars avoid Tartaria because it is not respectable, and it is not respectable because scholars avoid it. Meanwhile, independent researchers and curious individuals who explore the topic are branded as conspiracy theorists. Academia does not need to disprove Tartaria to suppress it. It only needs to refuse to acknowledge it. But there are cracks in the silence. Occasionally, old documents surface in forgotten libraries, showing maps of Tartary or encyclopedic entries describing its expanse. Amateur historians question why such records vanish in the modern era. Architects and engineers note the impossibility of certain 18th and 19th century structures being built with the tools available at the time. These voices rarely make it into peer-reviewed journals, but they thrive in the margins, in private discussions, in online forums, and now, in documentaries like this one. The silence of academia is not a lack of evidence. It is a wall built to protect the existing order. For to admit Tartaria into the annals of serious study would be to admit that history itself may be a controlled narrative, that civilizations more advanced than we imagine once walked the earth, and that they were erased. In the end, the greatest cover-up may not be what is said, but what is never said at all. Tartaria's name lingers in silence, daring us to ask, what knowledge lies locked away, unspoken, in the ivory towers of academia? When mainstream academia refuses to acknowledge Tartaria, who dares to keep the story alive? The answer lies in the shadows, among alternative researchers, independent historians, and even whistleblowers who risk ridicule, reputational loss, and sometimes more, to reveal what they believe has been hidden from us. In recent decades, the rise of independent research platforms, small publishing houses, underground documentaries, and online communities has given space for voices outside the ivory tower. These researchers comb through old maps, forgotten encyclopedias, and archives to piece together a picture of an empire that mainstream historians dismiss. They compare 18th century world atlases, which clearly show Great Tartary, with modern editions where the name has vanished, asking, who decided history should change and when? Some of these alternative voices highlight architectural mysteries as proof of Tartaria's suppressed past. They point to star forts, ornate cathedrals, and massive stone structures supposedly built in the 18th and 19th centuries, yet beyond the abilities of the populations credited with their construction. For them, these buildings are not anomalies, but relics of an advanced Tartarian civilization, absorbed and repurposed by those who came after. Whistleblowers, though rarer, add another dimension. There are accounts, often anonymous, from individuals working in museums, archives, or excavation teams who claim to have seen evidence deliberately hidden from the public. Stories emerge of artifacts locked away in basements, or of photographs, diaries, and letters that contradict official narratives but are labeled for restricted access. While such claims are difficult to verify, they fit a consistent pattern. Evidence exists but is systematically buried. The internet has become the great amplifier for these voices. Forums, video platforms, and podcasts allow researchers to share discoveries without institutional approval. While critics deride these communities as echo chambers, they also represent the only spaces where Tartaria can be openly discussed. From detailed video essays to scanned archives uploaded by enthusiasts, the digital underground has become the archive of the forbidden. Of course, not all alternative voices agree. Some see Tartaria as a technologically advanced empire, others as a looser cultural confederation erased for political gain. Still others connect Tartaria to broader mysteries, the mud flood theory, global resets, or even lost technologies like free energy. This diversity of theories often leads critics to dismiss the entire subject as incoherent. Yet, in a strange way, the disagreements only show how alive the mystery still is. The greatest contribution of alternative researchers and whistleblowers is not that they provide definitive proof, but that they keep the question open. They refuse to let silence close the case. For every map uncovered, every strange ruin examined, every suppressed document brought to light, the narrative of official history is challenged. And so, even as academia remains silent and empires have long buried their traces, Tartaria lives on. Not in classrooms, but in whispered archives, in online discussions, and in the relentless curiosity of those who refuse to stop asking, what really happened? Why is Tartaria not simply a historical curiosity, debated openly alongside other disputed civilizations like Atlantis or Lemuria? Why is it treated instead as forbidden history, a subject shrouded in taboo, ridiculed by scholars, and buried beneath silence? To answer this, we must explore not only what Tartaria represents, but what it threatens. At its core, the mystery of Tartaria questions the official timeline of civilization. According to mainstream history, humanity has followed a neat progression, from primitive tribes to ancient empires, then medieval kingdoms, finally to the modern nation-states we know today. But Tartaria, with its sprawling maps, monumental architecture, and unexplained erasure, does not fit this model. Its existence implies that history may be cyclical rather than linear, that advanced civilizations may have risen and fallen long before the ones we are taught to admire. Acknowledging Tartaria would force us to rethink the very foundations of our past. This possibility threatens more than academic pride. It destabilizes the political legitimacy of empires and nations. Russia, China, and even Western Europe built their modern power on territories once labeled Tartary. If Tartaria were recognized as a legitimate empire, questions of cultural inheritance, identity, and conquest would arise. Were modern empires simply the successors of Tartaria, or were they its usurpers? By erasing Tartaria, the victors ensured their dominance was seen as natural and inevitable. There is also the matter of technology. The architecture attributed to Tartaria, massive star forts, intricate domes, colossal buildings supposedly erected in the 18th and 19th centuries, hints at knowledge beyond what was officially available at the time. Free energy theories, advanced construction methods, and possibly even lost sciences lurk beneath the stones. To admit Tartaria would be to admit that humanity may once have harnessed technologies we can barely replicate today. Such a revelation would undermine narratives of industrial progress and raise uncomfortable questions. What else has been hidden from us? Finally, Tartaria remains forbidden because it belongs to the realm of controlled memory. Institutions like universities, museums, and publishers shape collective knowledge. To keep Tartaria buried, they label it pseudoscience, ridicule its researchers, and deny it space in public discourse. This strategy is effective because ridicule is a powerful weapon. It ensures that most people never even dare to ask the question. Yet paradoxically, this suppression fuels the fascination. The very fact that Tartaria is forbidden makes it more compelling. If it were truly a baseless myth, why would it provoke such relentless erasure? Why does the word itself vanish from history books? Why are ruins ignored? Why do old maps contradict modern narratives? Tartaria remains forbidden not because there is nothing to find, but because there may be too much to uncover. It is not merely a lost empire. It is a challenge to everything we think we know about civilization, power, and progress. And perhaps that is the deepest reason of all. History is not just about the past. It is about control of the present. And Tartaria, if spoken aloud, threatens to break that control. For centuries, Tartaria lay forgotten, a name relegated to the dust of old maps and dismissed footnotes. But in recent decades, the myth has begun to stir again. What was once whispered in obscure circles or buried in forgotten encyclopedias has now emerged into the mainstream of alternative history discussions. The myth of Tartaria has become more than an academic curiosity. It has become a movement. This revival began quietly, with individuals stumbling upon anomalies, the strange architecture of world fairs, photographs of buildings half buried in earth, or maps from the 1700s showing a vast Tartarian empire. The internet amplified these discoveries. Forums and social media groups became gathering places for enthusiasts who compared notes, shared scans of old documents, and debated theories late into the night. What was once the domain of a handful of researchers grew into a global conversation. Today, Tartaria has a life of its own. Thousands of people across the world actively explore the mystery, treating it as both a puzzle and a cause. Videos, podcasts, and books dissect every angle: the mud flood theory, the suppression of old technologies, the political erasure of entire peoples. The sheer variety of interpretations, from serious historical investigation to fantastical speculation, is evidence of how deeply the legend resonates. Tartaria is no longer a forgotten word. It is a symbol of hidden truths. What makes this movement powerful is not just the evidence it collects, but the questions it raises. Followers of the Tartarian mystery are united less by agreement and more by suspicion. Suspicion that history has been manipulated, that knowledge has been withheld, that civilizations greater than our own may have risen and fallen without acknowledgement. In this way, Tartaria has become a banner under which broader doubts about official narratives gather. It is not only about one empire, it is about who controls the past. The visual evidence plays a vital role in the movement's growth. Photographs of ornate, impossible architecture circulating online often spark curiosity in viewers who never considered that their own cities might hold secrets. Buried windows, massive domes, and inexplicable star forts become not just historical curiosities, but personal mysteries. The question is no longer distant, it is local, immediate. Suddenly, Tartaria is not a lost empire in some faraway land, but a story woven into the bricks and stones of our own streets. And beyond the research lies something deeper, a sense of cultural awakening. For many, Tartaria symbolizes a lost golden age, a civilization advanced, harmonious, and perhaps freer than the world that replaced it. Whether or not Tartaria was ever real in the way maps once described, it has become real in the imagination of those who seek it. It has become a myth reborn, carrying with it the power to inspire new generations to look at history with fresh eyes. Thus, what began as whispers of an erased empire has transformed into a movement. Tartaria is no longer forgotten. It is alive again, in debate, in discovery, and in defiance of the silence that tried to bury it. While mainstream academia dismisses Tartaria as a cartographic error or obsolete term, a new generation of modern researchers refuses to let the empire slip quietly into oblivion. These individuals, scattered across the world, work outside the ivory towers of universities. They are writers, architects, engineers, digital archivists, and ordinary people with extraordinary curiosity. And though their methods differ, they are united by one mission: to resurrect Tartaria from the ashes of forgotten history. The heart of their work lies in old archives and digital libraries. With more documents scanned and uploaded online than ever before, researchers now have access to sources once hidden behind academic walls. Old maps from the 16th through 19th centuries, once gathering dust in obscure European collections, are freely available in high resolution. Many clearly mark Great Tartary, stretching across Siberia and Central Asia. To modern Tartaria researchers, these maps are not trivial. They are proof that a vast empire was once acknowledged, only later erased. Architecture is another battlefield of inquiry. Researchers photograph and catalog star forts, monumental cathedrals, and government buildings that seem far too sophisticated for the time periods to which they are attributed. Videos and essays circulate pointing to the impossibility of constructing such vast stoneworks with horse-drawn carts and rudimentary tools. Some propose that these structures harnessed energetic principles now lost to us. Others argue they were simply remnants of a vanished empire, repurposed by modern states after Tartaria's fall. Then there are the mud flood investigators. With cameras in hand, they document buildings in cities around the world with sunken windows, half-buried arches, and lower levels concealed beneath the earth. They argue these are not the result of centuries of urban buildup, but the scars of a cataclysmic flood in the 18th or 19th century, one that wiped Tartaria from the surface and forced a historical reset. Modern Tartaria researchers are not bound by geography. Online communities allow them to collaborate, compare, and critique each other's work. A researcher in Moscow might upload photos of strange ruins in Siberia. One in France might uncover a forgotten encyclopedia entry. Another in the United States might analyze blueprints of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair and note their uncanny resemblance to European palaces. Together, they weave a patchwork narrative, incomplete, fragmented, but compelling enough to challenge the official story. Of course, their work faces relentless ridicule and suppression. Critics brand them as conspiracy theorists, cherry-picking anomalies to build fantasies. Yet this resistance only fuels their determination. For every dismissal, researchers uncover new anomalies, new evidence, and new questions. In the end, what defines modern Tartaria researchers is not certainty, but curiosity. They do not all agree on what Tartaria was, an empire, a federation, or even a symbol of cyclical resets. But they agree on this. The past is not as simple as we are told, and history is not complete. Their work ensures that Tartaria remains alive, not as a closed case, but as an open question. The story of Tartaria has always lived on the margins of recorded history. But in the modern age, it has found a new home, conspiracy culture. Here it has evolved beyond forgotten maps and buried ruins, becoming part of a much larger conversation about lost civilizations, hidden technologies, and the manipulation of history itself. In online forums, podcasts, and late-night discussions, Tartaria often appears alongside other mysteries: Atlantis, ancient aliens, secret societies, and global resets. To many within conspiracy culture, Tartaria is not just a lost empire, but a symbol of everything concealed. It represents the possibility that our world is built on lies, that the story we are taught in school is only the surface of something far deeper and stranger. The mud flood theory, for instance, has become one of the most popular threads in this culture. Conspiracy researchers argue that a global cataclysm in the 18th or 19th century buried entire cities under layers of mud, erasing Tartaria in the process. Photographs of sunken buildings with windows beneath ground level are circulated as proof, sparking heated debates. For some, the mud flood is the smoking gun, the physical evidence that a great reset took place, one powerful enough to wipe an empire off the map. Others connect Tartaria to theories of free energy and hidden technology. The domes, spires, and star forts of Tartarian architecture are reimagined as devices for harnessing atmospheric electricity, perhaps providing limitless power before it was deliberately suppressed. In this version of the story, Tartaria's erasure is not just about politics, but about control of technology. If humanity once had free energy, who took it away, and why? Tartaria also weaves into broader conspiracy narratives about the control of knowledge. Researchers point to the sudden disappearance of Tartaria from encyclopedias and maps in the 19th century, seeing it as evidence of a coordinated effort by empires, institutions, and academia to hide the truth. For believers, this fits neatly into a larger worldview. That history itself is manipulated by powerful forces to maintain control over the present. What is fascinating is how fluid Tartaria's place in conspiracy culture has become. Some view it as a literal empire with advanced technologies. Others see it as a metaphor, a stand-in for all the civilizations lost, forgotten, or deliberately erased from history. In either case, it serves the same purpose: to challenge the official story and keep alive the suspicion that the world is stranger than we are allowed to believe. Critics dismiss this as fantasy, but for those who embrace it, Tartaria is a kind of cultural rebellion. It represents the right to question, to doubt, and to search for hidden truths. Whether true in a historical sense or not, Tartaria's place in conspiracy culture ensures that it continues to live as both a mystery and a movement. And so, Tartaria is no longer just a forgotten empire on old maps. It has become part of the mythos of our time, a story that refuses to die, whispered in the corners of a culture that thrives on forbidden questions. At first glance, Tartaria may seem like nothing more than a historical oddity, a forgotten name on old maps, a puzzle for enthusiasts of lost civilizations. But as the movement has grown, it has become clear that Tartaria is more than just a story of the past. It is also a mirror held up to the present, forcing us to ask uncomfortable questions about power, knowledge, and the way history shapes identity. For many, Tartaria represents the fragility of historical truth. If an empire as vast as Tartaria could vanish from textbooks, what else might have been erased? The possibility unsettles us because it challenges our faith in institutions, universities, governments, and museums that claim to preserve knowledge. Tartaria reminds us that history is not simply a record of facts, but a narrative shaped by those who control it. In an age of misinformation and media manipulation, this realization feels more relevant than ever. Tartaria also resonates because of its symbolism of lost potential. Followers of the theory see its grand architecture and supposed technologies, from star forts to free energy devices, as echoes of a civilization more advanced than ours in certain ways. Whether or not these interpretations are accurate, they highlight a longing for a different kind of progress, one less tied to exploitation and more aligned with harmony, beauty, and natural energy. Tartaria becomes a metaphor for a road not taken, a civilization that might have embodied values we yearn for today. On a personal level, Tartaria has become a tool of awakening curiosity. It invites ordinary people to question what they see around them, the buried windows in their own city, the ornate government buildings that seem out of place, the inconsistencies in historical accounts. In doing so, it empowers individuals to investigate, to research, and to think critically about the stories they've been told. In an era when skepticism is often branded as dangerous, Tartaria encourages the courage to ask, what if the official story is incomplete? In a broader cultural sense, Tartaria has also become a form of resistance. It unites diverse groups under the shared suspicion that history is not neutral, but engineered. For some, it is a rebellion against academic elitism. For others, it is a way of reclaiming forgotten identities, imagining themselves as descendants of a hidden empire rather than mere subjects of modern nation-states. The myth of Tartaria thus becomes an act of defiance, a refusal to accept the past as closed. Ultimately, what Tartaria means for us today is not just about the past. It is about the freedom to question. Whether Tartaria was a real empire, a misunderstood confederation, or a metaphor for forgotten cycles of history, it continues to inspire conversations that pierce the veil of authority. It reminds us that history is alive, not fixed, and that the stories we inherit are not always the only ones worth telling. Tartaria may remain forbidden in the halls of academia, but in the public imagination, it thrives as a challenge, a hope, and a warning that no empire, however great, is immune to erasure, and no truth stays hidden forever. Every mystery reaches a point where speculation must face its most difficult question. Was it real? Did Tartaria truly exist as a vast empire erased from memory, or is it nothing more than a mirage born of old maps, misunderstood ruins, and a human hunger for hidden histories? On one hand, skeptics argue that Tartaria was a mere cartographic placeholder. In the age of exploration, European mapmakers labeled unknown territories with broad, generalized names. Great Tartary, they claim, was not a political entity, but a convenient term for lands east of the Ural Mountains, home to nomadic tribes, shifting khanates, and peoples outside European knowledge. From this perspective, Tartaria's disappearance is simply the natural refinement of geography as more accurate information became available. But believers counter that this explanation is too neat, too convenient. Tartaria appeared not only on maps, but also in encyclopedias, travel accounts, and official documents. Entire regions were described as part of Great Tartary well into the 18th and 19th centuries. How could such a vast and consistent designation vanish so abruptly, replaced without trace by the modern nations we recognize today? To them, the silence is itself suspicious, a redaction, not a correction. The physical evidence complicates the picture. Starved forts, monumental cathedrals, and buried buildings remain scattered across the world, their origins and construction methods raising more questions than answers. Mainstream historians attribute them to European colonists or local rulers, but alternative researchers see in them the fingerprints of a forgotten civilization. Could these structures be the bones of Tartaria, misunderstood or deliberately misattributed? Then there is the mythic dimension. Stories of a lost empire resonate because they echo patterns found in every culture. Atlantis in the west, Lemuria in the east, Hyperborea in the north. Perhaps Tartaria, whether literal or symbolic, is part of this broader cycle, a reminder that civilizations rise and fall, often leaving only fragments behind. In this sense, the question of whether Tartaria really existed becomes more nuanced. Even if the empire was not what some claim, its legend reveals deep truths about the fragility of memory and the way power reshapes the past. The eternal question may never have a definitive answer. Perhaps Tartaria was a genuine empire, erased for political convenience. Perhaps it was an exaggeration of diverse cultures woven into a single label. Or perhaps it is a myth reborn for our times, a story that reflects our suspicions about authority, our longing for lost golden ages, and our refusal to accept that history is as simple as it seems. In the end, whether Tartaria was real in stone and empire, or real only in imagination and symbol, it lives on. Its very persistence, in whispers, in research, in the global movement of curiosity, proves that it has become more than history. It is now a question etched into the human story itself. What else lies forgotten, waiting to be rediscovered? And so we reach the end of the mystery of Tartaria, a name erased, an empire forgotten, and a history buried beneath mud, stone, and silence. Was Tartaria real, or just a phantom of old maps? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in ruins scattered across the world, and in the stories we are told not to ask about. If you enjoyed this exploration into forbidden history, please like this video to help others discover it. Don't forget to subscribe to Whispered Empires for more journeys into the mysteries of our past. And I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think Tartaria was a real empire or just a forgotten label? Leave your answer in the comments below. Let's uncover the truth together.